This is Atomic Shinobi, and today I'm going to narrate third and final part of What If Naruto makes Mizore fall in love with him. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share and subscribe to this channel, and for more exclusive and spicy content, follow me on Patreon. Link is in the description below. And now wasting no more time, let's start the story.
The robotic voice of a pale boy kneeling in front of his leader in the Hokage's tower declared, "The loyalty seals have been successfully planted on every ninja above the rank of Genin Master Danzo. Good. Now that the village's military might is under control, we can move our attention to other matters, such as locating our weapon." Folders and papers were neatly organized on his desk. Another of his soldiers entered, as if on purpose, and there was a slight shimmer in the air. Only his hair was visible, and he was wearing a full-body suit. He placed a scroll on the oak desk and said inaudibly, "The forensic team is done, Master Danzo. The report is ready for your reading." He smoothly unrolled the roll of paper after using his old fingers to roughly peel the first layer. As he read, he displayed no other signs of irritation except the smallest furrow of his eyebrows. It seems that a significant quantity of Yuki had triggered another event based on the trace amounts of energy that were left at the scene. Although the precise cause is unknown, preliminary investigations suggest that it was some form of teleportation, evident from leftover energy at the scene that did not correspond to any type of Yuki or chakra. The last theory is that the massive release of Yuki led to the violent opening of a primitive portal, which resulted in a distorted form of instant travel. The Toad Sage was the only person he knew who could truly look into something like that, he thought inwardly. Regretfully, the sage was still in a coma after suffering serious injuries during the sound invasion. He had even chosen not to give the sage the loyalty seal. The loyalty seal would not only be undone, but it would also erase any trust he could instill in the sage, who was skilled in the sealing arts. He took his brush and jotted down an order. The search for the third student, the Slug Princess, would receive more funding. She would be able to awaken the Toad Sage, and she possessed unparalleled healing powers during this period. Then the leaf will be one step closer to being the ultimate power. These were the thoughts of an elderly man who would have a significant impact on many aspects of the younger generation. A tiny glimmer of happiness appeared in his chest, but it was quickly eclipsed. Limiter seals tuned to his Yuki level when he took suckers allowed his clones to complete a side project. He discovered what happened to his Yuki during those times by probing deep inside his body while sucking on lollipops. It turned out that each time he consumed the suckers, his Yuki was painfully and violently suppressed deep within his body, even taxing his reserves during periods of rest. On his arm, he was now painstakingly drawing a suppressor seal that was intended to accomplish the same goal. Since the pain was caused by the abrupt suppression of his power, a sudden drop in body temperature would not cause him any pain because the seal kept his power suppressed at a low level. He also gave the seal permission to progressively stifle his energies over predetermined time periods as an extra feature. After allowing the ink to dry, he briefly used his chakra. He felt his power being gently pushed back, and a small, contented smile appeared on his face. The seal vanished onto his skin after sending another tiny energy pattern. By default, it would take the seal 30 minutes to reduce his power to the designated level. However, it all felt too familiar, so as soon as he stood up again, he reached for a sucker and tossed it into his mouth. For a brief moment, his body was in excruciating pain, causing him to bend forward, but he quickly stood back up as he felt his own strength. After giving the seal another look, it briefly reappeared and gave him some information. Unless he requested otherwise, his current power level had been recorded and would remain that way. However, when he returned outside to see how his clones were doing, he noticed that he had overlooked an important question. What was it meant to accomplish? The race began when the school bell rang. Blurs hurried past one another as they fought to be among the first as the doors flew open. They galloped to the cafeteria, leaving the slower ones behind. Miss Shizuka cocked her head in perplexity. It was only recess, right? In any case, the canteen's food wasn't particularly good. As she pulled out her boxed lunch, raw fish, she asked herself. She inhaled the scent of wet fish dreamily, stars shining in her eyes. She was lost in her excitement, as evidenced by her licking of her lips, tail, and cat ears. She threw herself at the food with sharpened teeth. The student stopped when he realized what he had called forth, Erm's miss. She exposed her sharpened nails and blazing eyes to him. His mind raced back to the last time those same nails had painfully scratched his face. He was out of the class faster than a bullet in less than a second. She resumed her usual routine. She trailed them, hiding in all her favorite places, until Kurumu called her again, anyway. Mizore. Stop stalking Sukune. She joined them exactly as planned, taking her customary position directly behind Sukune and frightening the succubus once more with ease. She responded with her typical lil smile after he greeted her with a courteous smile. He gave her less than a few seconds, as usual, before Kurumu, as usual, wrapped her body in his hand and diverted his focus. She sighed and wondered why she was thinking about such things at this particular moment. She had never thought of them before. Regarding stray thoughts, despite her attempts to divert her attention, her thoughts had progressively begun to focus more on Naruto as the days went by. Her heart ached a little more every day she missed seeing him, but she always told herself that the pain would eventually subside. Recalling what she had done, she silently covered her shirt with her hand. With the exception of the house he had built, Naruto would not even be able to locate her. However, she had been experiencing a strange sensation, as though he was always close to her but never with her. When she struck Sukune, she was knocked back into the conscious world, jarring her from her reverie. He thrashed his arms in an attempt to get his bearings. Mizore's arm quickly sprang out and squeezed his clothing. She pulled them both to their proper positions. She retreated a few paces and merged herself into the bustling haze of pupils, acting on her instincts. Out of sight, she would watch from there. Her entire focus was on the scene in front of her. Her friends faced each other. Her eyes narrowed and her mind redirected every thought, thickening the atmosphere. For the past week, she had done everything she could to stay away from him, her mind screaming. Anything at all to break their connection. She had made the decision to put an end to it before it was too late. Even if her heart did not agree, Naruto would eventually find his real life partner in his immortal life after meeting another immortal being. But now he was there, in her line of sight, and she in his. Naruto appeared to be at ease as he stood and gazed at the four people in front of him, who had stopped moving as soon as they saw him. He glanced around him and saw that a crowd had begun to gather. The vampire's hand then caught his attention. The vampire, however, had a nervous confidence as they fixed him with their enraged stares. She pulled gently on the boy's arm, and he followed her hand. With a look of silent assurance, Kurumu watched, flagrantly disregarding her witch friend's warning, seemingly certain that he would soon learn his place. "We finally found you, coward. You didn't think that just changing classes and scaring Yukari would mean you could escape justice?" she asked. She didn't know what he had done to cause Yukari to warn them to avoid him, but she was furious inside and didn't like it at all. For quite different reasons, Naruto also didn't like that. He hated not knowing what other people knew, so he figured they had something else planned because he wouldn't undervalue them again. He immediately concentrated on any hints he could find. His eyes focused on the rosary on her chest, anticipating the vampire's next move. As he saw the tiny, exact marks engraved on the metal, his mind went awry. Applying his understanding of lesser-known arts, his eyes widened rapidly as he realized what was on the rosary. He swiftly retrieved an armband and slid it onto his arm. He also turned off his suppressor seal with a single thought, but he was careful to limit the amount of power he released. It was one less thing he had to worry about because the crowd instantly dispersed upon seeing a PSC member. Before long, a massive wave of Yuki blasted into his senses, overpowering Mizore's startled and alarmed gasp. He swore. He wasn't prepared because, only a week prior, he had employed a technique that had cost him more blood and energy than he would have preferred. Even so, he only had a tenth of his energy reserves left, and to make matters worse, he was only able to access a quarter of them unless he wanted to put even more strain on his body. His body was still healing, so he would need to exercise extreme caution. He could not afford to be careless in his attacks, particularly ranged ones, especially since his weary senses were still only dimly aware of Mizore's presence. He shifted his body posture subtly, bracing himself for battle. The girl with the soft pink hair had vanished, to be replaced by a strong, self-assured woman. Her pupils were slits encircled by red irises, and her long, flowing hair was silver. As if he were a piece of trash, the woman appeared to be staring at him with hatred. But as soon as she saw the armband, her entire demeanor shifted from calm to irate. He was pressed for time. She left without a signal, her arm ready to strike with devastating force. The force behind the punch sent him flying, his head leading his body. He fell to his knees as his body collided with the wall. He could see another punch coming at him, and he blinked the stars out of his eyes. He leveled his arm and extended it to absorb the blow. As the two connected, Yuki Ona's cry for him to move went unheard. The ground beneath them bore trench marks from the shockwave that resulted. The only sign of the vampire's shock was a slight widening of her eyes. She scowled, quickly schooling her features. Next, her leg shot upward, targeting his head. His hand remained clamped over her fist as he withdrew. It would have been breathtaking if it had been an acrobatic performance. She was flipped over his head and made an arc in the air due to her redirected momentum. She was thrown back the way she came after he twisted his body sideways, spinning her in a circle. She hit the wall, bending her abdomen and rolling her legs behind her. She launched herself thunderously toward him, her feet planted on the wall. He chose to dodge, allowing his body to miss the vampire bullet by folding his knees beneath him. He was blind to Mocha's grin. He raised both of his arms, cursing the injustice of it all. A second later, her knee struck his resistance. With chakra at his feet, he adhered himself firmly to the ground, causing it to crack beneath him. As the scene unfolded, Mizore's legs trembled and her stomach churned as her mind argued and yelled at her body to act. He raised his right hand above him to seize her as soon as her kick began to lose its force. He cocked his right hand back, focusing Yuki on a tiny point at the back of his arm. His hand shot forward with a tiny jet-like stream of energy, propelling the vampire ahead. The vampire's body pushed through the quickly opening hole with a painful crack of the wall. But there was also a hit that the vampire had managed to slip in. He became extremely aggressive after receiving a less than gentle kick. He bit back a painful cry and fell to his knees. Then the ugly side of his spontaneous attack emerged. In an attempt to calm the burning energy, he clasped his left hand over his right elbow. He still lacked sufficient precision in his control. He dodged a slash from the succubus as his senses screamed. After his hands touched the floor, he attempted to push himself aside. In his right hand, a searing pain flared up. He haphazardly pushed himself upright after stumbling clumsily to his feet, just in time to avoid another lethal blow. He launched the succubus in the direction of the wall by extending his left leg. As he got closer to the ground, his right hand automatically sprang out to catch himself after he had turned his body with the force he had applied to his leg. As his arm got closer to the floor, his eyes grew wide. It was not intended for the ground to be soft or vertical. The still, injured Yuki. Ona caught him, and he heard a whisper of pain. His body recognized the girl, causing his muscles to tense and then relax. Her eyes darted wildly among her friends as her arms encircled him. "Stop, please." Kurumu paused while she was getting up, and Yukari stopped trying to manipulate Sukune when he stopped trying to assist Kurumu. As they watched their own friend defend the enemy, two of their minds went blank and one of them wondered if it was all sanity. Instead, Naruto experienced a wave of guilt upon realizing that he had once again succeeded in creating a rift between Mizore and her friends. Hadn't that been his initial motivation for wanting to keep them apart? He lowered his gaze and agonizedly tore himself away from her as gently as he could. He was afraid to look her in the eyes. I missed the look of horror and shock on her face. Experienced and refined instincts cried out. His eyes shot up and widened. From the hole came a jagged glint. His Yuki gathered in front of him in an attempt to deflect the devastating blow that caused him to become embedded in the ground. Unlucky fragments of the tiled floor flew and chipped, and one of them accidentally cut Mizore's sweatshirt's front pouch without her knowledge. Either Kazushi was correct when he cautioned him against taking Yuki Ona's suckers, or he needed to really brush up on his skills. That after eating them, they would impede his speed for extended periods of time, with the severity growing as his maximum speed increased. To make matters worse, he shouldn't try to flush it out of his body by using too much power while Mizore is around. He would still have to get by. He instantly launched himself backwards and away from the flaming leg that was about to decapitate him, wrenching his body out. He allowed his instincts to take over in his panic, but they weren't human. A stream of fire shot out of his mouth as it flew open. The fire's light filled the hallway with a glorious orange glow that illuminated everything. It was by no means a small flame that his breath produced. As the enormous fireball got closer to them, Mizore's eyes grew terrified. She pushed as much of her Yuki as she could into the ground and slammed her hands down. In less than a second, an ice barrier was created. Steam filled the space as it came into contact with the incoming plasma. Her body objected to the abrupt release of energy because it was unprepared and had not fully recovered. She cleared her blurry eyes and shook her head. She placed her legs beneath herself shakily. She ordered her limbs to push herself up, but they were unable to sustain her weight. She didn't fall, though, unlike the suckers that fell unintentionally from her sweatshirt pouch. His terrified gaze swept over her. Sorry, Mizore, I'm sorry." He stood in front of her, holding her by the shoulders while kneeling in front of her. A sorrowful grin appeared on her lips. He hadn't intended to. She clarified, "I just overexerted, that's all." Her friend's cries were inaudible to them. His eyes welled with tears. "I'm so sorry. If only I had just left instead. My being here is just causing you so much problems." "Idiot." His sputtering ceased, and his vulnerable, terrified eyes met hers. His entire thoughts had just stopped. Even though her logical mind strongly opposed it, the current circumstance helped her realize what she really wanted. Her heart had raced with each passing second during their altercation. Every time they disagreed, it seemed as though she was also affected by some of his suffering. However, Sukune wasn't the reason, he was the reason I was hurt. Her blue eyes met Naruto's. He had been the cause. Her heart ached every time her friends fought, but it was more because of Naruto. It had been painfully obvious to her mind from her own heart. However, why? Even if she did love Naruto, they would never be able to work out, she asked herself. Her treacherous mouth was in the middle of saying, "If you leave, how am I going to," when she broke off. Why? She questioned herself once more. Why was she so intent on undermining herself? Her friends were still attempting to locate everyone as the steam continued to obscure them. In contrast to the moment they were sharing, there was chaos all around them. Her logical mind fought an internal battle to wrest control from her emotions. In any case, she was losing the battle. Her heart was the side that had to win, though. Her mouth was slowly forced open, each moment bringing her one step closer to victory. But in the back of her mind, she had just come to the conclusion that she probably wouldn't be able to say it again if he didn't hear it the first time. Her hands clenched into fists as she struggled to stop herself and say, "I." Lo, Vei. She tensed all her muscles and made another fruitless attempt, but it was almost finished. She stopped thinking for a second, prior to her realizing what she had done. Mizore? Naruto questioned hesitantly as his thoughts replayed what she had just said. As though to reaffirm that she had actually done what she had done, she repeated, I love you Naruto. I, Mizore Shirayuki, love you, Naruto Uzumaki. It was as if a huge weight had been removed from her, making her body feel lighter. But now she understood the full significance of what she had done. She stared at Naruto, her eyes flinching more and more. Her mental state was getting closer to the precipice of hysteria with each passing second that he remained silent. Too much time had passed in the silence. His mind still reeling from her confession, he started. I've known you since I was 8. You were there on my first real celebrated birthday. You were with me for years, we played and learned together so many times. So many times I looked at you. A warmth would bubble from inside me. For many days and nights after we were separated, you were the inspiration and light that kept me going. I never knew what this feeling of warmth was that seeped into me deep within every time you smiled at me. A gentle smile adorned his face as he said, but now, I think I have a good idea what that feeling is. I think I love you, Mizore. They gazed into each other's eyes, penetrating every inch and every corner more deeply than before. Their lips were getting closer, and their head was getting closer, but he halted. Mizore froze and said, You're afraid. He was aware that he had witnessed her nude appearance and the one thing she had kept from him. Could she tell him right now? What would happen if he changed his mind? What if he chose to despise her? They had left their time. They were blown clear of the steam that had covered them. As he tried to regain his footing, the powerful gust of wind threw Mizore into him. He was alerted to the arrival of a new player by his opponent's frantic cries. His anxiety subsided as he recognized the new presences. He still had to comply. Do you trust me? He said in a low voice. Mizore gazed into his bewildered and dazed eyes. His cries were visible in his eyes. She gave a nod. He had quickly retrieved a pair of handcuffs and tied her hands together. Until the very last second, he maintained eye contact with her. As PSC members poured onto the scene, Masahiro's commanding voice echoed down the hallway, Captain Uzumaki. Explain. The other captain appeared taken aback by his rank as a captain, but she bounced back fast. Holding Mizore at his right, he instantly straightened his back. With a quick glance to the side, it seemed that Captain Dashiko had already assisted in the other four's arrest. In front of them, their hands were bound, but their binds were unique. The cuffs contained hidden seals that strengthened the metal and strengthened the bindings using the wearer's own strength. Mizore moved toward him. To calm her nerves, he lightly squeezed his right hand on her arm and drew circles on her skin that were hidden from view. Masahiro observed the situation and said, There was a minor scuffle, and I was engaged. The witch wasn't struggling, but she was afraid. Concerned, the succubus was attempting in vain to sever her bonds. While the vampire could be summed up in one word. Irritated, the boy was literally jumping around trying to get away. She turned and twisted, but she was unable to free her arms. She was restrained by her own strength. Infuriatingly, he observed that some students were present, attempting to blend in while sating their curiosity. He glanced at both of them, took note of Naruto's subtle signal, and then gave the order. He didn't even glance at the four. Captain Dashiko, bring them to the detention center, except for the Yuki. Ona. Then meet me in my office. Captain Uzumaki, follow me to my office and bring her along. His people swiftly followed him as he turned around. Since Mizore's friends were only able to observe her being taken away from them, the cries of indignation felt unanswered. The atmosphere changed as soon as the door was closed. The abrupt change left Mizore speechless. As her handcuffs were taken off, she massaged her wrists. When she asked Naruto a question, he gave her an apologetic look. He took her in his warm hands and massaged her wrists, saying, "Sorry. It's fine." She watched Masahiro warily, choosing her words carefully. "The crucial question is, but, what's going on?" He scratched his neck sheepishly and said, "Well, it's a long story. But basically what happened was that I took a look at the PSC and before I knew it I was a captain. Although it wasn't precisely what occurred, it was sufficiently similar." She chuckled softly, despite the circumstances. That kind of thing was typical of Naruto. In less than a minute, they were able to shut out the outside world, almost exactly like what had happened just a moment ago. Every time she laughed, a tiny part of him would jump inside. He burst out laughing when he realized how absurd his logic truly appeared. As their visible happiness subsided, they once more found themselves looking at one another. Before Naruto got too deep, Mizore closed her eyes. Rather, she gave in to another instinct. Naruto leaned slowly in her direction, his hands securely encircling hers. They pressed their lips together more and more. They were both in a shared reverie when Masahiro coughed. They both leapt back, startled. Mizore's aura darkened as she turned to glare at Masahiro. Naruto appeared to face comparable dangers, but he concluded that they required a more private setting. He turned back to Masahiro and grinned slickly. Beside him, a pillar of smoke materialized. "He'll give you the report. We'll take our leave." To his unseen annoyance, the two left without even looking at his response. It seemed like everything changed after they were gone. It took the clone no more than 5 minutes to explain what had transpired. Masahiro produced a manila folder and slid it to the clone without saying anything. He turned to the first page and started reading the synopsis. There were 2 different knocking sounds. Before giving the go-ahead for the person to enter, Masahiro waited for Naruto, clone, to pocket the folder. She bowed to them both as she closed the doors behind her, and they both returned the greeting. "Deshi. I trust the prisoners are secured?" "Yes. Now then, allow me to introduce you to Naruto. He'll also be a captain. The two of you will work hand in hand to run the PSC under me." An outstretched hand startled her, causing her to shift slightly. She gave Naruto a tentative smile before responding with one of her own. Their partnership was indicated by a firm shake. Her brow furrowed in inquiry. She said, "I hope you don't mind. But I planted a seal on your arm." She glanced quickly at her arm and saw a tiny black patch move and solidify. He reappeared behind her, overshadowing her, and suddenly his aura seemed to darken. She looked at the 2 other people in the room and then snapped her eyes up, stumbling a few feet away from him. "It's a seal that allows us to keep in touch." Her developing horror was overshadowed by a curious inquiry, so that statement was anticlimactic. The cheeky smile he flashed said, "It allows us to communicate via code in pulses of minute energy and transport small items between us." As he pointed accusingly at Masahiro, she puffed up her cheeks, catching on to the playful smile they both shared. "You knew he was going to do that," Masahiro said, raising both of his arms in a mock defense. The red-haired girl stared at him in shock, her mouth hanging open, and he finished with a false horror expression on his face. Hey, he said, "don't go around pointing fingers at people." Naruto trailed off as he walked around the girl, teasingly pointing a finger at her. "He's right, you know." She was further made fun of by the slur that was added to her name. "It's not nice to point fingers at people, Deshi. Chan." She unhooked her bow staff with a look of complete incredulity and indignation. Her smirk played them both, giving her superiors looks of well-deserved rage. She set off at a fictitious starting signal, trying to slam both of their heads in while carrying a bow staff. He trailed behind her, sidestepping to let her in first. As she went by, something glinted in his eyes. He noticed that she was wearing the necklace he had given her. Nothing was there when his hand flew to his neck. In what location had he put it? He'd find it later, he thought, quickly pulling himself out of his panic. There were plants scattered throughout the well-lit detention facility. They had a real dungeon for that, so it wasn't intended to be a pseudo-dungeon. They finally stopped outside one of the holding cells after guiding Mizore through the complex layout of the facility. He immediately retreated as the cell door was pounded. His head felt like it was going to be pierced by 4 intense looks. Despite the fact that the vampire had her rosary back on, he concluded that she probably couldn't have it off for very long. But when Mizore was brought to their attention next to him, their taunts and insults were stopped. "Mizore?" she asked, standing slightly behind Naruto. She didn't respond. Naruto spoke instead. As he watched their responses, he said in a professional tone, "Your violations of the school rules will be noted, but for now you are all free to go." The witch appeared unconvinced. "What's the catch?" With a snap of his fingers, 8 members, all wearing PSC uniforms, streamed in. "There is no catch. I will release you all from the cell. A squad of PSC members will escort you out." The door was unlocked by one of them. When the cuffs were taken off, they reluctantly left after presenting their hands. "Wait." Everyone stopped to stare at the speaker. The vampire questioned, "What about Mizore?" That seemed to be an indication for everyone to look at her. With everyone staring at her, Mizore felt under pressure all of a sudden. In an attempt to get rid of some of the anxiety, she fidgeted. Then a safe, warm hand touched her shoulder. She looked up into Naruto's eyes. Rather than telling her to do what she wanted, he seemed to encourage her. She was able to stand thanks to his encouraging smile. But when she had begun to appear conflicted, he had responded on her behalf. Naruto said unequivocally, "She'll be with me for now." Although he would later come to regret it, he truly ought to have anticipated that it would occur. The succubus had suddenly rushed toward them. With one of her clawed hands aimed at his neck, she grasped Mizore with the other. As they attempted to recover from the alien situation, the PSC squad looked shocked. They had never been fought like this before, especially after being let go unharmed. Her battle cry reverberated throughout the corridor, but Naruto would not meet his demise as he had the first time. He decided he didn't need to move either after glancing at the vampire, who didn't seem to move. He decided enough was enough as her razor, sharp claws got closer to him. As soon as she was within striking range, he released the Yuki that had been charging his left arm. His arm was now firmly wrapped around her wrist after her nails had threatened to cut him. Her breathing was restricted as his other hand encircled her neck. He quickly applied pressure, breaking her wrist and choking her scream. He ripped the succubus off the ground and threw her against a wall in an explosive display of strength. It was refreshing to see the shock on her face. His own ears detected the slight cracks in a few of her bones. In that brief instant, he had made sure to project nearly all of the power he could currently access at them, amplified by his intent to kill. He noticed that several people, including some of his own members, had turned white in the hallway. Unbeknownst to him, a silted pupil on Mocha's rosary seemed to focus, and the orb appeared to glow. The inner Mocha, who had far more sophisticated sensory abilities than those on the outside who had sensed his power, was shocked to be trapped in the persona of the fake Mocha. She had experienced far more than any of them. Despite a deeper part of her wanting to leap at the powerhouse, she allowed a tiny bit of fear to seep in after being hit in the pride. Strong mates were required by the mating instincts of her species. They had gone to her friend's aid as if on cue, but Mizore remained behind him despite noticing her muscles twitch. While Sukune stood between them and Kurumu, Mocha seemed to be nursing him, and Yukari appeared to be evaluating the damage while closely monitoring him for even the smallest twitch. He stood with his head up in defiance, his arms outstretched. He was surprised to see the boy's eyes flashing. His red, slit eyes alternated with his normal ones. He set his face in stone and filed the information away. He needed to correct them on a few points. "I have been attacked by you lot more than once now. The first time, I admit I had underestimated you succubus. Then during our recent confrontation, and even now, I do not have access to more than 10% of my power and my body is strained. This will be my only warning, do not presume that the group of you are special and can break the rules without facing consequences. It does not matter if rumors are floating around that some of you helped to take down Kuyu. I for one do not believe them. Most of you here should know why." His gaze widened on the girls in particular. After finishing his sentence, he looked at Mizore. There was nothing more he could tell them. Sukune appeared to look at Mizore, as though he was wondering why she wasn't there to support Kurumu. Naruto put a comforting hand on her shoulder and urged her to turn to face him, grinning with hope and longing. Mizore's smile revealed an unsettling degree of vulnerability, and his heart slowed momentarily. She could bring out that side of Naruto, though, and she couldn't help but feel a little warm. She turned away from them and timidly took one of her friend's hands while they stared in shock, but before they could respond, Naruto motioned for them to move, and the squad swiftly led them out. His eyes wandered idly over the forest beyond while his back rested on the tiles. He twirled a familiar sucker in his mouth. Though he was concerned about Mizore, he felt that what he had done was right. All he did was sigh out loud. His voice was dry as he asked, "Do you think I overdid it?" The Yuki, Ona next to him appeared to consider the question. Mizore remarked nonchalantly, "I don't know, but I'm grateful," she continued, anticipating Naruto's astonished and intrigued expression. It feels like I've had a large weight lifted from me. I feel so much lighter now because of it. She didn't have to tell her friends about her situation in a brutal way because Naruto had, in a sense, lessened the impact of what she had to say. They were accompanied by a gentle breeze that brushed their hair and moved their clothing. As the giant orb vanished over the horizon, the sun's orange rays gradually waned. As the light faded, the landscape gradually became darker. The vibrant grass and vibrant plants are now lifeless and only shadows of their former glory. As clouds shifted and the moon's gentler light fell upon them, their silhouettes wavered. Mizore. About what you had said earlier when we were in the mist, Naruto said softly, allowing his ideas to come to life. As Mizore's head slowly turned to meet his eyes, he turned to face her and absently moved the lollipop to one side of his mouth. Her heart skipped a beat as she asked, "Why? Why did it feel like you were sacred?" Naruto watched as his own eyes clouded with worry and her eyes suddenly filled with panic. But before he could take any action, the panic vanished as swiftly as it had appeared, to be replaced by a pair of cold, rational eyes. She had filtered her emotions and put on her most stoic face, saying, "You're immortal, Naruto, I'm not. I don't want you to suffer after I'm gone." There was silence for a second, but then he responded. He said with unwavering seriousness, "I know." He wasn't even a little uncertain. As he gazed up at the sky, his thoughtful eyes appeared to stray to one side. For a moment, he avoided looking into Mizore's startled eyes. She winced as a dull, incomprehensible pain tightened around her at Naruto's melancholy tone. "Kazushi had told me that I would likely never die unless I was killed, and that friends I made weren't always so lucky, or cursed depending on how you see it." He began his own argument before Mizore could continue to make her point. "But, don't you think it's better to have loved to never have loved?" asked the man. Mizore's thoughts came to a halt. "Besides, this isn't what's really bothering you, is it?" She was genuinely unable to conceal anything from him. He was still familiar with her and could understand her, and even her attempts to tell falsehoods had failed. However, a tiny part of her was strangely reassured that they still had that connection. Even so, could she really? A warm hand cupped her cheek and raised her eyes to meet his, cutting through her doubts. It made her decision in an instant. "You can trust me, Mizore, I'll always share your burden." Her eyes now showed resignation, an uneasy acceptance. Mizore slowly removed something from her sleeve with her hand. She hesitantly moved her hands forward and shifted so that she was directly next to Naruto. One by one, she unwrapped her fingers almost carefully, revealing a snowflake. His snowflake. His breathing became a little labored. He gazed at her with a curious expression in his eyes. He started to ask, but she spoke before him. "This snowflake, it's our reminder of the promise we made, right? The promise to pick snowflakes when I turn 17, she said softly. As he gazed at her, his head nodded slightly, illuminated by the faint blue glow the snowflake emitted, signifying its full reserves. In Yuki Onna tradition, when a Yuki Onna turns 17, she has to attend the Snow White ceremony. Being a race of mainly females with a short fertile period of merely a decade, elders long gone had to make a hard decision. Yuki Onna girls have to be married by the time they reach 18. The lucky few get a good boyfriend before that time. The Snow White ceremony is primarily used to bless those who haven't found mates by then, in hopes that it will allow fate to guide them. Those who fail to get mates by 18 are forced into arranged marriages, mainly with humans who eventually hopefully fall in love. In sadder cases, snow women kidnap humans, and after getting pregnant the human is put back where he was found, and most of the times the human is asleep the whole time. Mizore stopped to think. For those who have already found a boy before they turn 17, they attend the Snow White ceremony with their partners. In this case, the ceremony serves as a marriage of sorts. The final sentence was whispered but still audible. Her hands gripping the necklace trembled as she tried to keep her fingers open, and her eyes had squeezed shut just before she finished speaking. She interrupted herself as her words began to break and crack, saying, I'll understand if you hate me now, I'll understand." However, her own mind made a fruitless attempt to sense the remote possibility that she might be able to carry on without him. As she struggled to keep her feelings from escaping her, her body trembled. Her world froze in an instant. Idiot! The slightest of touches made contact with her lips. Her ears were filled with the sound of her slow, thunderous heartbeats. She opened her eyes and looked directly into Naruto's, whispering, "Wa-ti. I already promised you that night, didn't I, Mizore? Even if I didn't know what it was then, it doesn't really make a difference now anymore, does it?" he said, his deep eyes fixed on her as his warm breath lightly touched her cheek. She experienced an uncontrollable, alien, and blissful sensation that rushed to the tips of her toes and the edges of her fingers. The freshly lit fire gave her muscles newfound strength to push. Once more, Their lips touched. It wasn't as short, but it was almost as chaste as their first. It was far more sentimental, emotional, and meaningful. They never took their eyes off one another. What they had just shared left them gasping for air. The trust that glowed in their eyes for one another, the shared vulnerability in their locked eyes. Only two souls that resonated in kind could radiate such warmth and understanding. They remained on the roof until the last of the orange rays were completely obscured by the night. As they appreciated the warmth and security that each other provided, their hands clasped together. The school's headmaster gave his friend a nasty look and said in a weary voice, "It's this kind of moments where I question why we're still friends." For a moment, their glowing eyes locked as the bus driver simply cocked his head forward. The grin his friend had plastered on his face made him want to just do the same. "Calm down, Mikagami. It's just a small change to your plans, nothing will go wrong." He tried to relax by rubbing his head with his hands. The human boy, Sukune, was meant to get the undivided attention of all those girls. So that when he finally turned into a pseudo-vampire I would be able to step up my plan to promote coexistence between humans and monsters. Then you introduce this new student who comes in from nowhere and he pretty much laughs in their face while taking the attention of the snow girl. This will force me to alter my plans more than I like. Mikagami rumbled with growing annoyance as expressed their discomfort from sitting for so long. To the headmaster's increasing annoyance, his glowing eyes spit daggers at the blue uniformed man, who at the moment found the wall of his office much more interesting. "And to make it worse, I can't figure out what Ayashi monster he is, and you still haven't told me." "It's an old favor. A really old one, from someone I never expected to see again." "Heck, I had almost forgotten about it too. They don't want me to tell just anyone what kind of Ayashi he is. It would attract too much attention from unwanted ears." Mikagami's thoughts turned to every species of Ayashi he was aware of, particularly those that had been classified as nearly extinct or absurdly powerful. Totally oblivious to his friend's mounting annoyance, he made the decision that perhaps he should share some information with him, but it wouldn't be enjoyable to reveal everything at once. "He's a hybrid." Mikagami's eyebrows shot up. He noticed that Naruto had a great deal of control over his powers, which was uncommon for hybrid Ayashi. He had been intrigued by the boy's methods, even the ones he had performed, because he was unable to identify any Yuki in their usage. This implied that the boy either possessed a different kind of energy or possessed a very unsettling degree of accuracy. As he remarked, "I should probably get Masahiro to handle them. What about the outcast Ayashi? They might try to recruit him and they are already rather troublesome, and the amount of control he has." His eyebrows furrowed over the main issue. The headmaster had narrowed his search and was getting closer, but not close enough to draw a firm conclusion. His memory worked as he retrieved as much factual information as he could about Ayashi. He won't have any problems with control, and he might as well be considered a full-blooded Ayashi since he has all the powers a purebred would have. Heck, he even has access to power from his other side. When matched together, even fewer species did not clash. He was still unable to come to a single conclusion because there were still a lot of options. The bus driver had a conscience, as evidenced by the distressed expression on his friend's face, because he chose to end his friend's suffering. "He's one of the ancient Ayashi species. He is one of the ancients." Mikagami quickly dumped possibilities left and right until he finally stopped at one, so that one statement would have been very helpful at the beginning. He saw that the boy had the ability to control fire, and the only ancient people who possessed this ability were The bus driver smirked and said, "Phoenix." At last, his friend understood. It was not surprising that his eyes widened slightly. With only a few members for eons before abruptly going extinct, they had long been considered an extinct race. In the Ayashi world, a war had essentially broken out at that point. He would be aware that in order to keep the monster world from destroying itself, the three Dark Lords had to work themselves to the bone. Along with all the races that the Phoenixes had aided in the past, as described in ancient runes and scrolls, some of the fire manipulating species lamented their extinction. However, some other species, many of which were armed with fire and were relieved that the strongest beings of fire were actually no longer there, had rejoiced and started a war. Recalling the unadulterated power of the ancients, they both shuddered. The Phoenix was the oldest Ayashi species, although many were unaware of this. The Phoenixes did not mind being grouped with other less ancient species, which wished to be regarded as equals in front of the other younger and weaker Ayashi species. This is the only reason why many Ayashi logs mention an entire group of ancient species. Therefore, those with greater knowledge had chosen to refer to only the Phoenixes as the Ancients. Because the Ancients' raw power was unmatched by any other ancient species. Ancient writings described multiple instances in which a single phoenix melted an entire planet, as well as instances in which their unadulterated heat surpassed that of the sun. Rays of vibrant light appeared as the sun rose. They landed on everything that was exposed, including grass and trees, among other things that the sun had given life to. But alongside those who relished the sun were others who sought protection from its rays. The two lay with their hands linked and exposed to the world, just like so many years ago. The deeper meaning was the difference this time. Throughout the night, Mizore's arms had twisted around Naruto's, and she had followed suit. Her head was beneath his, and his was above hers. It was a serene and lovely sight. The phoenix's eyes flickered open and he felt a surge of energy as the rays touched him. Sweat began to form as soon as they touched down on the Yuki, Onna. Her body attempted to escape the heat that surrounded her, and her eyes creaked open languidly. Her finished sucker, a white stick, dropped from her mouth. Naruto was startled out of his blissful absorption of the sun's energy by her shifting. She tried to calm herself by focusing as much as she could, but it only bought her time. Weakly, her hand moved to her front to find the stash of lollipops she kept in her front pouch. Nothing was grasped by her hands. She opened her half-lidded eyes a little in terror. A momentary spout of panic ran through her, and her heart began to race. Abruptly, beyond her limited field of vision, she experienced the well-known sensation of a sucker being forced against her lips. She sighed with relief as her body cooled, ready to accept it. She gradually regained her strength and her mind cleared of the foggy heat. Her blurry mess sharpened into Naruto as her eyes cleared. As he hovered over her, a worried expression appeared on his face. "Better now?" she asked, pausing briefly before nodding her head in response to the unadulterated worry in his eyes. Now that she was awake, she had time to wonder about two things. What had become of her sweatshirt's front pouch, and how had Naruto been consuming suckers during his entire stay at the academy? Why was he carrying one? She chastised herself in her mind for not recognizing that small detail sooner. With a stoic expression tinged with curiosity, she said, "Thank you. But Naruto, why do you have suckers with you?" His face first showed relief, then momentarily became confused, and finally a cheeky smile appeared. "On my 9th birthday, your mother gave me a year's supply of suckers. However, after checking it, it felt more like 2 years' worth. I didn't think much of it then, but right now." He trailed off in mid-sentence as the realization struck him like a ton of bricks. His words, "I think I know what she had been trying to imply," were hushed as their faces flushed. For a few minutes, they were surrounded by birds chirping and leaves rustling in the morning wind. "So, did you run out of suckers or something?" Mizore asked, bending down to examine her front. It appears that a big cut went through the front of her pouch, presumably letting all of her suckers fall out. "I lost them, and I'm going to need to find a bag now," she muttered, avoiding the last part because it would undoubtedly interfere with her spying skills. The phoenix on her neck was fingered by her fingers. She thanked God that she had fortunately worn her necklace because the only item in her front pouch had been her sucker because her field gear was frequently too heavy to store there. Not much of significance had been lost. She would need to buy a new bag for the time being, but it would take several more months to get the special cloth she needed to fix her sweatshirt. In her village, the worms that produced the necessary material were only active for a few months out of the year. As Naruto rummaged through both of his thigh pouches, she had failed to notice his movements. He produced an empty pouch, deciding to seal some and rearrange a few other items. "Would you like to borrow one of my pouches?" she asked, instantly diverting her attention from her imagined shopping excursion when she saw what had been offered. Naruto's pouch. Before a slight flush came over her face as she hesitantly accepted the offered bag, she glanced up at Naruto. She looked at the straps and stared, perplexed, while softly saying, "Thank you." It was completely different from anything she had ever worn before. Her head was only made dizzy by the many straps that crossed over one another. She looked up at Naruto with a tilted head while gently stroking her hair. After raising an eyebrow, Naruto said, "I'm not sure how to put this on," before realizing that his thigh pouch was intended for ninjas and warriors. It was designed to remain firmly in place without impairing his range of motion. In order to secure itself to its wearer, it featured a significant number of carefully positioned straps, which to an untrained eye would appear to be just a collection of straps. When he realized what he would have to do, a similar flush appeared on his face. He pointed to one of her legs and took the pouch. Both children had heavy blushes, despite the practical reason. When his hand touched her thigh, his heart raced, Mizore's blush deepened, and his mind practically held its breath. He began to kneel down to take a better position, mentally chastising every thought that contained more intriguing ideas, but he froze. Although it was convenient to put the pouch on because Mizore's skirt was not very long, he would not be able to fasten the straps without noticing some, less than modest, items. Then, regrettably or fortunately, it appeared that Mizore had noticed the tense few minutes of his predicament. Her hesitant question, Naruto, caught his attention. His hands were frozen in place as his red face gazed at her. Her eyes followed his stance, and before long, her face's skin tone matched his. She muttered something to break the silence of his question. She tried to hide her blush, but it was impossible to hide. "It's fine, go ahead," she said. He only hesitated for a second before lowering himself even lower. He made every effort to put everything else aside and concentrate solely on fastening the straps as gently as possible. Nevertheless, it was difficult to ignore his peripheral vision. In a desperate attempt to maintain his attention on the task at hand, his racing thoughts sped from one thing to another. To him, at least, it had seemed like it had taken far too long. When he was done, he had leapt back up almost immediately. Looking more closely, the pouch was a good fit for her long stockings with light and dark purple stripes. Mizore tried lifting her leg and bending it in different ways, but it remained quite tight. Naruto then found one of his storage seals in front of her. A tiny blue bag appeared after he sent out a lengthy series of steady pulses of energy. He swiftly grasped it with his left hand, gave it a quick shake to determine its weight, and then presented it to Mizore. In a silent inquiry, she arched an eyebrow. She accepted the offered bag, untied the opening, and looked inside. She remained in that position, gazing into the bag for a short while before responding again, almost animatedly. She let her head drop elegantly to the side and tipped it to meet his, her lips moving in a playful smile. As she pocketed the suckers, she said, "Thank you," in a cute way. She had no idea why, but she was now experiencing an overwhelming emotion. She couldn't quite place it, but the sensation was very familiar. She did, however, recognize it because she carefully rolled a snowball behind her back. Every time they played, she felt exactly as she had in the past. Despite their foolishness and childishness, they had been content. His attention was captured when she whispered his name in a sublime way. For a brief moment, his eyebrow appeared to furrow as he attempted to understand why that particular tone made him shudder, but it remained just out of reach. Then glimpses of a few memories flashed, and his eyes seemed to light up. Sadly, he didn't have time to respond. His cry of shock reverberated throughout the clearing as the ball shattered when it came into contact with his face. The cold caught him off guard and sent him flying back. As he attempted to exact revenge, he heard the Yuki Onna laughing. With his eyes still closed, he used it to find his target and hurried toward her. The only clue that he had heard correctly was her abrupt yelp. That is, until he had struck her with an unjudged speed. He opened his eyes as they rolled around on the floor, laughing every time. Mizore kicked Naruto off of her with a forceful thrust after folding her legs into her body. She was able to push herself back onto her feet with ease after losing the excess weight. But as soon as she saw Naruto, her feet stopped moving. He was standing in front of her, smiling, rather than a crumpled body stumbling back onto his feet. A playful grin on his face hinted at an intriguing retaliation. Mizore shuddered. She was suddenly reminded of one basic fact, and she knew exactly why. She required a material medium, but Naruto could easily and silently create clones out of thin air. Her eyes grew wide as a circle of Naruto materialized around her, encircling her on all sides. They appeared to exchange brief glances while grinning at each other, almost as if they were speaking. Then they all moved forward together. Mizore leapt. Instead, she was greeted with smirks, which caused a pout to appear on her face and redness to creep up. "Not fair, Naruto," she yelled immaturely, furiously crossing her arms over her chest. "I never said it was." That was the only warning she received before being abruptly tackled by multiple redheads, and her cries and screams were ignored. "Aaa," Shizuka yelled. "Congratulations, Sukune Aono, you are the new class manager." While hurling confetti, despite the boy's obvious shock and refusal, the rest of the class applauded. He turned to try to persuade others of his position, but all he saw was Mizore's empty seat. He suddenly realized that he was the class manager, which gave him more power. He could learn more about Naruto's relationship with Mizore. Only his friends noticed his abrupt pause. Everyone else had been too preoccupied with congratulating the boy. He turned back to the class and saw that Shizuka had somehow materialized right next to him as a list was abruptly pressed into his hand. When he read the first line of the list, the teacher's utterly innocent expression made it even worse. Class manager's duties. He was a human imprisoned in a school of monsters, and now he had to cooperate with them instead of remaining in the background. He cursed and yelled in his head, pleading with his imaginary savior to come to his aid. It was clear that he would detest his new responsibilities. At the far end of the classroom, his senior was laughing uncontrollably and acting more like a prick than helpful. He repeatedly attempted in vain to push himself back onto his feet, his nails scraping the floor. The werewolf persisted in laughing and risking the end of his dreadfully brief but entertaining life. ignoring the death stare of one succubus and barely avoiding another of her swipes. Now, back at Sukune, a rain cloud loomed metaphorically over his face, and his head was hung downward. Mocha stood next to him and made a fruitless attempt to lift the boy's spirits. All of their antics were abruptly stopped by a knock on the door. A male student emerged as the door slid open. Despite wearing the school uniform, he dressed smartly and exuded confidence. His modification gave it a more formal suit-like appearance. Without waiting for a response, he went on, "This is the newspaper club, correct? I am Hokuto Kaneshiro, head of the carnival committee. I'll need Sukune to follow me, he is needed to represent his class." For a brief moment, Sukune pouted because he could already imagine his private time with Mocha flying away, and it seemed to him that he did not even need to go after his duties because they would come to him. Even so, he dragged his body to follow Hokuto with a sullen expression because he knew that this and many other responsibilities in the future were unavoidable. His voice was a little lifeless as he said, "I'm coming." Hokuto raised an eyebrow slightly, but no one ever noticed. The boy in front of him was not the Sukune he had heard about, who possessed strength and could vanquish a variety of formidable foes. Sukune prayed inwardly, a faint fear taking the place of his brief dread. Every other monster in the room was staring at him while he was in a building that appeared to be about to collapse on itself. In his opinion, none of them appeared particularly typical. Hokuto stood by him and patted him amiably. For whatever reason, Hokuto had made it to Sukune during their walk here. "Don't worry, we'll gladly help you if you need assistance." Although Sukune was unable to identify the precise reason, Hokuto's demeanor, speech, and appearance all suggested that he was a born leader. To put it mildly, he felt uneasy because he was by himself, without his friends, and he would be expected to demonstrate his qualifications here. The issue was that even he was aware that he was merely a typical person. His supernatural friends are the only reason he has come this far. However, Hokuto's first sentence seemed to dispel all of his doubts, and his head perked up as he focused entirely on the speaker. Every person who heard his speech was enthralled by the unwavering confidence that permeated every word. Everyone in the room felt his words resonate with their deepest desires as their very being was called to respond. The one thought that struck everyone in the room as he spoke was a forecast of how successful the school carnival would be that year. But as Hokuto tried to stifle his smirk, a completely different thought was racing through his mind. She materialized in a flash, and the cold instantly penetrated her flesh. Surara was occupied next to her, looking for any creases her kimono might have acquired. Miyuki was a little nervous about Sarera's arrival. But when someone gives you a death glare that is so cold it freezes your soul and won't let go of you until you comply, things tend to change a little bit. For her grandson and his friend, Miyuki did what she could. In her mind, she fervently hoped that they were no longer avoiding one another. As she swept the room, she became aware of something. It was strange that Mizore wasn't where she would typically go for her treatments. But more concerning was what Surara might do to her in the event that she failed to locate Mizore. She cast a quick glance to her right and saw Sarera's icy, inquiring gaze. She turned her head to the right, concentrated, and searched for the girl who had gone missing. They were easily distracted by the creak of the door. With a slightly labored breath, Mizore stood at the door and said, "Haha, mother." However, she appeared to have lighter posture and brighter eyes. His presence behind Mizore drew their attention, and they asked, "Obakan, grandmother, Surara-san?" The two women exchanged a quick look, one a little suspicious, the other a little pleased. While their facial muscles twisted and pulled to create non-verbal expressions, important questions and information were conveyed through some unintelligible means. With two innocent questioning glances, the two kids avoided the two adults and entered the room hand in hand. They watched with silent amusement as they attempted to solve the hypothetical puzzle in front of the two adults. Then Mizore had an idea. As she discovered a way to both bring the two adults back to consciousness and earn a point in a small game she had been playing with Naruto, a secret smile appeared on her face. She pulled on the hand that was clasped in her right while simultaneously allowing herself to fall onto the bed. But Naruto had also seen it, much to her dismay. Instead, she was pulled to Naruto's side when he acted a fraction of a second faster. As he savored her blush, he whispered in a husky voice, "It's 3.0 now, Mizore." Additionally, it had fulfilled its other function. The moment Surara and Miyuki did that, their silent exchange came to an end. Shocked, they remained in their positions for a few minutes, trying to process what had happened. It took a few more minutes before Miyuki responded more forcefully. As she muttered incomprehensible curses about teenage emotions and over-anxious mothers, she turned sideways and raised her hands to calm her tense mind. She would have undoubtedly passed away from the extreme stress that Surara had been putting on her over the past week if she had been just another woman. Surara's response was completely different, as a soft smile appeared on her face to mask the overwhelming joy that had been on the verge of taking over. As her focus shifted to older and new fantasies of her larger family, her plans to get the two back together no matter what were pushed to the back of her mind. She shivered somehow when she saw her mother's dreamy smile. Unknowingly, she found herself cuddling closer to Naruto, as though to conceal her mother's ulterior motives. He hadn't spent much time with or for his friends over the past week due to his busy schedule. He had rejected all of the succubus's attempts to entice him, without even realizing it. Every time the vampire tried to speak to him, he was able to wriggle out of it. Even worse, he hadn't seen Mizore once in the previous week, not that he had noticed, and he had managed to remain totally unaware of Yukari's strange behaviors. Currently, though, he had been asked to meet Hokuto for a unique and unidentified purpose. He moved steadily down the cozy corridor, which was softly warmed by the torches. He noticed the absence of the other regular members as soon as he pushed open the doors that had grown so familiar to him over the previous week. Other than that thought, everything seemed normal. Sukune took a step back and raised an eyebrow, saying, "Sukune, I have been watching you." It had the feel of a corny manga. A tiny part of his mind was suffocated with incredulity as it evoked the repulsive idea that Hokuto wasn't gay, was he? His eyes grew even wider as the scene began to eerily resemble the books he had at home. "And after careful consideration, we have decided that you would make a fine addition to us, Sukune." Hokuto hadn't intended for that tiny part to breathe a sigh of relief. "Us?" was a question that slipped out of his mouth before he even realized it. "Surely, Sukune, you must have noticed those brief flashes where you just seem to change, the way your blood pumps furiously and how your vision just seems to become clearer and sharper." He hesitated before nodding. What had he just heard? "That's the vampire blood in you growing, Sukune." He froze. Yes, Mocha had been giving him blood injections, but she had stated that this was only temporary and that the blood wasn't meant to have any further effects on him. Hokuto's compliments had previously taken him to new heights, and they would do so again. Your determination and drive to change things and the fact that you are a developing hybrid makes you all the more suitable, Sukune. You are a perfect member. Unbeknownst to Sukune, a second figure stood behind him, keeping watch. As he prepared his trap, the figure waited for the smallest hint of resistance. Unsecured ends were a constant issue. He closed his mouth abruptly. "But I'm just a who," he said. It was never intended to be said. His mind was paralyzed by fear, even as Hokuto's inquisitive smile widened. His mind saw the truth in his statement, "A human, Sukune. We know, but we also know that you're becoming a hybrid. With all that vampire blood being injected into you, you were bound to change." After all, he had been experiencing strange feelings at random lately, particularly following fights in which Mocha had given him injections of her vampire blood. As the poor boy tried to process what had been said, his mental state experienced numerous hiccups. "Join me, Sukune. I am part of a group of similar people like us, Sukune. A group of outcasts just like you. We understand your plight, Sukune. After all, I used to be human too, Sukune." The possibility that Hokuto, the perfect leader, could be something else is particularly startling. With timidity, he questioned, You were once human, Hokuto? What had become of that perfect leader, the one without any imperfections? How could someone who was similar to him end up that way?" "I was human," Sukune was. Without hesitation, he gazed directly into Hokuto's eyes, asking him why. Something in his mind told him he really didn't want to know, but his curiosity overcame him. "This school is a cruel place, Sukune. It's not meant for humans. I had to become a hybrid to survive, and it looks like you're becoming one too. But, do you know what the cruel irony of it all was, Sukune?" A shift occurred in Hokuto's smirk. It evolved into something darker, more suited to a cruel master. Cold sweat trickled from his face. "I had become a hybrid to survive in a school for monsters. Yet, when they realized what I had become, I was treated even worse than before. Even my friends turned their backs on me. Even the one friend that knew I was a human beforehand. His friends wouldn't treat him that way, would they? He would have defended his friends and family at any other time, saying, 'Monsters and humans are the same, Sukune. They are both cruel and ignorant, hating what they don't understand, what they don't know.'" He would claim that Hokuto was mistaken, but he was no longer entirely certain. He wanted to confidently say, "Yes," but he was unable to do so. "I know you have purebred friends, Sukune. But don't let them stop you from joining us. After all, if they really are your friends, they'll understand, right? They would still stand by him since they had been there for him for a long time, right? And if you're still thinking over it, let me tell you a little something. We have power, more power than purebreds. We can help you find out more about Naruto, Sukune. Wouldn't you like to know how to win him? He's been bullying you ever since he got here, hasn't he, Sukune? Don't you want to know how to beat him? I mean, he has also been stealing Mizore from you, hasn't he? The rewards had caused one side of the discussion to prevail. Nothing else had been taken. Sukune grinned cruelly and vowed never to allow purebreds to pass him again. The one final thought that came to him was, Naruto will pay. In the end, it appeared that Kirya, his friend, had been unnecessary. He greeted the newest member with his customary smile, though it was tinged with a lethal tone that Sukune was unaware of. Welcome to the outcast Ayashi, Sukune Aono. Writing a letter to Miss Shizuka was all that was required of him. Now he only needed to visit the faculty office. Shizuka was already there when he turned a corner, grinning as he accelerated. However, his smile wavered a little when he saw that she had no paperwork. He had to give Hokuto credit for sharpening his mind because it was already considering other options. He drew the cat woman's attention and greeted her warmly. With her typical sparkle, she said, Sukune. He raised an eyebrow in curiosity as he considered her statement. About your request, it seems that I don't have authority to get what you want. Oddly enough, Mizore's information seems to have been moved to the same security as him as well. Her teacher's dejected expression told him a lot. Who does have permission to access files then? Maybe I could ask him or her instead, she asked. Her tail drooped and her cat ears pressed flat against her head. That was startling information. He had acknowledged that Naruto was a member of the Public Safety Commission, but Hokuto had previously assured him that PSC files would become more accessible due to the PSC's restructuring and their agreements with the headmaster. Unfortunately, it seems that the security level of his and Mizore's files are actually above even the head of the faculty's authority. They can only be accessed by the headmaster. But even this wouldn't account for the rise in Mizore's security. It was illogical. Later, he would have to meet his friends. Shizuka was always willing to help and did her best to support her students. I could set up a meeting with the headmaster if you'd like. There was a tiny gleam in her eyes as she looked up at him with hope. A hint of his normal self emerged, and he agreed with an uncomfortable smile while wearing a rather disbelieving expression. As he departed, his thoughts filtered through the other options he had considered, such as going straight after Mizore. In any case, where were his friends? It had been a whole week since he'd seen them. He halted abruptly in the middle of his stride, recalling something he had forgotten to check on for a week. Mizore. As his mind planned his next move, a deeper, unidentified emotion fueled his steps a little more. As he thought about the redhead who had been giving them so much trouble and hurting Mizore so much, his hands clenched at his sides. Since coming here, he has been at the beginning of all his current issues. In any case, when is the next club meeting? Together, a worried vampire and a dejected succubus strode down the corridor. She threw another planned scheme to woo her boyfriend out of her head, and her sad eyes wandered aimlessly. Mocha tried to guide both of them while holding her friend's shoulders. Kurumu slumped to her left as she yanked them to the right once more. Every few seconds, Kurumu muttered incoherently. But every few minutes, a few words could be heard, and they were of absolutely no assistance to the vampire. Recalling all of her recent attempts to even spend a few real seconds with Sukune made her own heart sink and ache. For the entire week, she had also not seen or heard of Yukari and Mizore. And then there was the Mizore issue. She was not at all relieved by the prospect of an enormous headache. The succubus stumbled and her body fell into her, sending her flying to the ground. She shoved Kurumu off her as gently as possible. She didn't have the strength to get to her feet, though, because it didn't seem like there was any use. Her mind wandered aimlessly while her hands lay limp at her sides. As she thought back, the memories she had made at the school flew by. Meeting Sukune, becoming friends, sucking his blood, running into rivals for his love, and getting into a lot of fights and near misses. Although she hated to admit it, their group had been quite chaotic and occasionally enjoyable. Every time they faced a challenge, it seemed as though they were destined to fail, but each time they emerged stronger and closer than before. She had even wondered at night if some of the things had been merely fantasies, the products of her desire for friends and her imagination. What had changed, though? What had become of her family, their amiable little group? His brain reeled from the shock, his hair casting a shadow over his eyes. His hands were shaking and his eyes were fixed on the bowl of frozen food. He found what had transpired to be so incredibly cruel that he found it difficult to process what had happened. His chopsticks were hanging limply, the only strand of noodles he had managed to get out of the bowl before the terrible event. His shaky hands held him above the bowl. His hand slowly fell to his side, but the frozen noodle held the pair of chopsticks in place. It was too much, that cruel sight. The only words that came out of his mouth were, Mizore, run. However, she remained motionless in her position, seemingly closely monitoring his response. Her legs moved as white smoke plumes suddenly burst around them, akin to the signal that a race was about to begin. Her legs had put a good distance between her and him before the rest of her body had even caught up. She wished that she hadn't spared the briefest of glances. Every face had the same blank expression, and the entire wall of clones had the original somewhere mixed in. She knew when they began charging without having to turn around. The first clone landed on her after she had been running for no more than 5 seconds. She aimed an ice dagger at it while freezing her hands. His demise was marked by a menacing poof, but his allies were not. She made a quick turn and threw one leg behind the other. She then swung her icy hands outward while her sleeves flapped. 3 poofs and 3 ice daggers were proof of her accuracy. A clone sprang for her feet as she performed a quick side flip to the right, leaving no time to celebrate her accomplishment. She put an end to the existence of that clone by flicking another dagger. After losing her initial momentum, she paused for a moment, but it was all Naruto needed. She was surrounded by 6. A pair immediately swooped for her, so they didn't waste any time in a stare-down either. She lowered her body a little by bending her knees, then slid to their left and swiped sideways with one of her clawed hands. The extinguishment of both her recent attackers gave her a slight sense of victory, particularly when the 4 people on the left refused to back down. It wasn't because they were tired, though, actually, they were just waiting. When they discovered that she had not learned from his previous antics, they were not let down. 2 solid arms encircled her from behind, trapping both of her arms at her sides. As the original reversed his cloaking technique and materialized directly behind her, she let out a small, startled squeak. The 4 clones then came toward her, and she was unable to assist in winning anymore. "You're going to pay, Mizore." She might have felt actual danger if the tone hadn't been slightly playful, but even so, a chill went up her spine. One after the other had secured a limb, severely restricting her range of motion. He had plenty of time to exact revenge while she was restrained on the ground. Feather-light tickles on her feet followed the excruciatingly slow removal of her shoes. His fingers then wandered north, looking for and using any weak spot they found. Eventually, as lighter emotions crept up on him, his stoic expression changed. He began to laugh amusedly and let it go. He exaggerated a cry and paused briefly to make a point before continuing with the melancholy opera. It had been such a nice day, clear blue skies and cooling breezes blowing by every so often. It had started out so nicely too, with a relaxing night of rest and what would have been my delicious bowl of ramen. But then, it all took a turn for the worst. As an evil ice witch came along and decided to play a mean prank on little old me. He gave her a sharp upward jab just under her armpits, and she yelled and jumped, forming a smirk. The mean old witch frozen my precious ramen. I even heard the cries my precious gave as it froze. Why, Daddy? Why did you let a cruel ice witch take us? And so I thought, if I couldn't save them, then I would avenge them. He pretended to be innocent while lightly tracing his finger down her face over her nose. So I shed blood and tears as I tried. Losing so many of my brothers along the way. But eventually, I did it. I caught the big mean witch. It was then I came to the curious question of what should I do? He said. His innocent, almost lifelike face played as he leaned his head in. Then, with fox-like guile, his fingers wandered. Her sides were mercilessly tickled once more, this time with greater accuracy and intensity, and he offered her no respite. The naive innocence he had just moments before was replaced by a cunning smile. It didn't seem like the best course of action for her to abruptly freeze his ramen in order to get him back for an earlier prank. Something tugged at her mouth, snapping her out of her anxious thoughts. She quickly responded by tightening her lips, but it was insufficient. They pulled her sucker out of her mouth in an impolite manner. Her expression was one of disbelief as she met Naruto's gaze directly. Now she found that jovial smile of his so damnable. He taunted her into putting up a stronger fight by dangling her sucker above her and enticing her to retrieve it. Before she chose to comply, her cheeks were a fiery red. She reached up with her neck and stuck out her tongue, drawing closer. He moved it to the side as her tongue licked it. Closer, closer, closer. She lowered her head and gave Naruto a chilly look, but he seemed unaffected. Once more, he lowered the lollipop and swung it teasfully above her. She pouted for a while before trying again, this time attempting suddenness and instantly raising her head. He pushed the lollipop away once more, much to her annoyance, but then, to her complete surprise, he tsked her in a playful manner. Wah! A hint of embarrassment caused her face to flush. Had Naruto simply acted like a child and played with her? Naruto saw a familiar scene unfold as Mizore refused to look at him and raised her chin in outrage. He laughed because it reminded him too much of the last time she had attempted this. But he would counter this time. After dangling it over her for a few more seconds, he lowered the lollipop as if he had given up. It drew nearer until it was directly above her lips. She tried the exact thing he had predicted, and he felt his ego being stroked. In an instant, she jumped up and attempted to seal her mouth around her sucker. But he had moved more quickly. He snatched his hand away after swiftly shifting it to the side and sliding the lollipop over her cheek. He swung the lollipop over her shocked eyes once more, mockingly reprimanding her, saying, "You should really learn to eat in a cleaner way, Mizore." Her face changed from one of complete incredulity to one of rage, and embarrassment swept through her in uncontrollable waves. He was taken aback by the unexpected exclamation, "Naruto," and she dealt him a cunning hand in that same moment. Choosing to be audacious, she unleashed 4 ice daggers, swiftly eliminating the clones as she combined her lips with his. Naruto's eyes widened and everything seemed to slow down in that instant, but before anything else could happen, a playful glint appeared in her eyes. She grabbed his sucker from him with her tongue. She gave Naruto a victorious smile as she pulled away and stood up, his lollipop still firmly in her mouth. His eyes briefly lost focus as his fingers lightly touched his lips. He appeared stunned at first, then incredulous, and finally with a gentle smile after emerging from his daze. He pushed himself up and took her sucker in his mouth. He still had the upper hand in their new prank war, but he said, "This doesn't make us equal at all. You know that, right, Mizore?" He was leading right away, even though they had reset the count when they started it in school. "It's just 8.1, Naruto, I can catch up." Her mock rage boiled over in the exaggerated comical silence that ensued, particularly when a fictitious crow cawed. However, Naruto's pleasant expression abruptly changed before she could respond. He spread his legs apart, a mask of emotionless coldness taking over his once happy face. He put his finger to his lips in a silent signal to remain silent, and she stopped. "Nah." He was straining his senses with his eyes closed. Abruptly, hazy shadows rushed out from the smoke columns, and 2 white plumes appeared on either side of him. The 2 shadow clones returned in a matter of seconds. One was on his left, and the other was on his right, a considerable distance away. She was immediately drawn to what they held. A struggling witch was grasped by the arms of one of the clones. Yukari attempted to touch the ground, but her legs hung off the ground. The other clone's right hand was gripping a recognizable wand. "How did you find this place?" was a straightforward question with a lot of hidden meanings. She didn't lose sight of the fact that it appeared she had discovered a location she shouldn't have discovered. Once more, her height worked against her when she attempted to reach for the ground. The words, "I won't ask you again, witch," were spoken so icily that she shuddered even though they weren't addressed to her. Mizore watched in mild terror, wondering where Naruto had developed this side. The threat concealed behind his typically affectionate gaze, sacred her. After a minute, Yukari did not respond, so Naruto glanced at the clone with her wand to make sure. He said, "It's said that witches are connected to their wands in a way, and from what I saw that day when I came it looks to be true. But I always did like to find things out for myself." Before the witch could respond, his clone began using progressively more force on her wand. She appeared fine at first, but eventually there were slight indications of discomfort. Her face twisted more and more as his clone's force on her wand increased exponentially. Her face began to show signs of agony, and soon her limbs were flailing around and she let out her first scream. "Naruto!" Mizore uttered as a hint of concern began to grow within her. When the witch screamed a second time, the clone that was holding her released her, and she fell shamefully onto the ground in a fetal position. It wouldn't take long for the other clone to sense the wand giving way as it continued to apply more force to it. As her body tensed in agony, she let out a third scream and wept as her fingers sank into her own flesh. Hot, raw pain streaked through her body as she struggled on the ground. "Naruto!" His clone came to a halt. She turned to face Naruto, who was staring at Mizore with wide, lost eyes. Yukari took trembling breaths as she lay motionless on the ground, her limbs sprawled lifelessly in front of her body. She stared straight ahead, her unfocused eyes remaining open. Her hair stuck to her face and a layer of moisture covered her face as her muscles pulsed in time with the pain's aftershocks. With a worried expression on her face, Mizore looked up at him while holding his hand. In the hopes that he wouldn't notice, she pushed the fear that had surfaced as deeply as she could. "Naruto?" His expression briefly changed to one of fear. He had dual thoughts, half of which was still in his serious mode, and the other half of which was a mess as he tried to explain things. But her gaze only seemed to soothe his. Her anxious gaze seemed to penetrate him and pull him out of his racing thoughts. He allowed the words to come to him after taking a few deep breaths. It was difficult for him to understand what had truly taken over. When I felt her presence in the barrier, my instincts just took over. With you here, it just got more, he said, tearing his eyes from her and turning to face the witch. This barrier, I had built this place for safety. To protect the seals here from thieves. With the right knowledge, someone could just easily turn our seals against us or even try to capture us for our power. He couldn't. No, he wasn't sure how to express it. The emotion that had consumed him seemed to be driven by a need. He tightened his hold on her hands and asked, "Did you feel threatened, Naruto?" For a few moments, Naruto remained motionless, almost thoughtful, and then he nodded rigidly. "Why?" he asked, his hands stiffening as his eyes darted around in search of a response. There had been a lot going on lately, and it was becoming harder for him to control everything. Each time, he had been shoved. Then she had entered his house, which was both there and his safe haven. He removed his hands from hers and shook his head. He squatted down and gently gathered the unconscious witch in his arms, saying, "I had lost control for a moment, it won't happen again. Mizore observed from her position, "I'm going to secure her first. I can't have her panicking and telling everyone about this place." Her gaze followed his departing form. Her unfocused eyes watched his departure back as her hands fell back at her sides. She picked up her wand monotonously while eyeing it on the floor before making her way back to the house. It was the ideal feeling. As she extended her hands, she could feel the soft grass bending beneath them. As she idly traced the outline of the clouds above in the serene blue sky, the soft aroma of the grass filled the air. Everything was calm. She sensed it, a calming feeling that enveloped her and brought her into harmony with the natural world. Her mind was lulled to sleep, and she closed her eyes. But there was a call. Yukari's body shot upright, and her eyes snapped open. As adrenaline kept her body in a ready state, her eyes darted from one spot to another. Adrenaline control slipped as her mind gradually came to the conclusion that she wasn't in any immediate danger. She relaxed and observed the details in her surroundings. Her eyes took in the room's wooden walls and her hat on the table next to her, while her hands felt the comfort of the bed beneath her. "You're awake?" she asked, focusing on the dim figure in a room corner. As it progressed, more information became apparent. The stoic face, the lollipop, and the purple hair. Mizore? Her most recent memory flashed through her mind, causing her eyes to widen. Her eyes darted around, searching for her wand, and she twisted herself, throwing her legs to the ground. However, something held her back by the waist, so the moment she attempted to push herself away, she ended up back on her back. As she looked down, she caught a glimpse of a chain's faint outline before it vanished. She stood up again and slowly pulled, questioning her eyes. It reappeared, a bright blue chain fastened to the bed around her waist. Magic? Barrier methods? Sealing methods? Despite her current situation, she was overcome by curiosity as she attempted to determine what was preventing her from moving forward. She started pulling experimentally once more and experienced a brief surge of energy that she had known before. Nature energy. How? She employed the same kind of energy for her magic. She lost her mind trying to figure out what was going on because, to the best of her knowledge, no other Yukai monster in Yukari Gakuen could control nature energy, and she could not recall any other witch attending Yukai Gakuen. Her mind only reached that point before she noticed the door of the room being opened. As his emotionless face turned toward her, she felt dread. Even more so when she saw that he was holding her wand. There was a flicker of fear in her eyes as they jumped from her wand to his face. She moved back a little and picked up a pillow to put in front of her. Mizore moved ahead first via an invisible signal. Yukari's eyes darted back and forth between them, splitting her vision. Although Naruto posed a greater threat, she was also uncertain about Mizore. As Mizore knelt before her, she uttered her name silently. Mizore's head inclined closer, but Yukari maintained her stance in spite of the mounting doubt. The icy whisper that graced her ears said, "Don't do anything stupid." It made her shiver, but it also gave her a slight sense of security. She softened her expression and turned to look at Mizore, who for a brief moment smiled kindly at her. Yukari. As he said her name in a sharp, short breath, she turned back to him completely. She reluctantly nodded while continuing to stare at his body, saying, "I may have overreacted earlier and for that I apologize. If there are any lingering effects, tell me and I'll see what I can do." But, she gripped the pillow tighter, her body tensing. With a small, appreciative smile, Mizore turned back to Naruto as a gentle hand rested on her shoulder. He didn't need to say it, especially as he discreetly raised her wand. "I'll need your word that you won't tell others about this place and I'll need to know how you found this place. Otherwise." He didn't respond, instead, his gaze remained fixed on her. "I won't tell anyone about this place nor how I found this place and I'll tell you how I found this place, but I have one condition. It appeared as though he even jerked his chin slightly to encourage her to go on, if her eyes weren't deceiving. He raised his eyebrows subtly, particularly in response to the witch's determined curiosity. You have to tell me how come you can use nature energy, because as far as I know you're not one of my kind and neither are you a sage. I would be able to tell if you were. She writhed for a few seconds as she chastised herself in her head for what was turning out to be a very foolish decision. The corners of his lips lifted a little as he asked, "You're quite observant, aren't you?" Her racing thoughts came to a halt. Her face turned slightly pale as she heard the quiet but firm promise, "Fine, I'll tell you about it, and I might even consider teaching you about it, but just remember. If you tell anyone at all, you won't live to regret it." Nevertheless, it was well worth the temptation of what had been offered. Here. As he offered her wand, the happy glee on her face gave way to an inquisitive expression. She took a few moments to truly take in what had been presented. She tentatively reached for it, but as soon as the tips of her fingers touched it, she grabbed it with all her strength, almost as if she was afraid he was just playing her. "It's pretty much part of you as a witch, isn't it?" she asked. As she muttered an apology to her wand, she held it in her arms like a mother would hold her infant. She squeezed the wand against herself while tenderly massaging her cheek. Before they disappeared, she was unaware that a few characters were glowing faintly on her wand. "Thank you," Mizore said, grabbing his right hand in the process. A soft smile appeared on his face at that precise moment. Then he noticed a slight tug. He saw nothing when he looked left, and nothing when he looked right. When his name was called once more, he arched an eyebrow. His body was suddenly pulled down by something. In a humorous attempt to regain his equilibrium, he flung his hands around. However, it was unnecessary because he was confronted by a rather irritated and vertically challenged witch who was currently extending her body as far as she could while taking into account the chain that held her back to the bed. He smiled sheepishly at her, allowing her to maintain his focus. She waved her wand around a few times without waiting for a response. "You wanted to know how I found this place, right?" she asked. The star in the heart at the top of her wand began to vibrate, emitting a green glow. The air was filled with faint green lines that traced back into the walls. Around her waist, the invisible chain glowed and then vanished. "We witches manipulate nature energy with our wands to practice magic. The catalysts we use in our wands are very inclined to nature energy, and when I felt a large source of nature energy in this area I followed the trail my wand showed. Also, we witches are naturally attracted to nature energy." Throughout her explanation, she felt a little worried. She felt a chill go up her spine when she noticed a sparkle in Naruto's eyes. His question seemed to have a deeper hidden meaning. "I see, so I can also assume that you are adept at manipulating nature magic?" he asked. After giving it some thought, she let her excitement get the better of her and waved her wand once more, creating tarot cards that flew around her before landing in her hands. She bounced on her knees and gave them to him. She was excited about the possibility of meeting someone else here who might be able to use nature energy. He studied the cards, rubbing them carefully. He hadn't even considered condensing natural energy into tangible materials yet, but they felt solid. He sent a tiny quantity of his chakra into one card, giving in to his inquisitive mind, and the cards took on a faint blue glow. Yukari watched in silent awe as the intensity of the blue glow changed. Naruto sent some of his yukai into the card after deciding to try something different. Before it abruptly caught fire, the card gave off a dazzlingly bright yellow glow. Ignoring the amused smile on his face, Yukari appeared to panic as she searched for objects to extinguish his blazing flame. When she eventually gathered the blanket beneath her, she saw that the redhead was not screaming before she threw it onto him. EHH. Her deadpan expression revealed as her mind attempted to process what had just transpired. His hand was still burning. In fact, the ball of fire he was holding was bigger than the one her card had first exploded into. He waved his flaming hand around before clenching his fist and putting out the fire. "Oh, you care? You seem awfully excited too though, despite what I did to you." Her increasing embarrassment was further exacerbated by the faintly playful tone in his voice. As Yukari fell backward onto her legs, she partially buried her head in the blanket and muttered something into it. She hesitated for a moment as she considered her next statement. "It's just that, most Ayashi and human hate witches like me because we're said to be half-breeds between them. Although I found friends when I got here," she said. "I never really found someone else here who could use the same energy I do. And finding one, you, just really makes me happy. I guess." Suddenly, she felt a small weight on her head, and it seemed to pat her. She raised her head to meet his soft gaze. Chakra and Yuki energy were not the same as nature energy. With the exception of the fact that, with sufficient training, chakra could be made to take on a particular form of Yuki, whereas Yuki cannot because it is too strong and inclined. Chakra is a more general form of Yuki. Everything that was alive was infused with the energy of nature. Living things both fuel it and are fueled by it. Whether they are physical or not, all creatures will contain some quantity of it in their bodies. Users of nature energy and those who are attuned to it eventually form unique, indiscernible bonds with one another as a result of this connection. Despite not being attuned to it at first, Naruto's constant manipulation of the energy had gradually accustomed his body to nature energy, and he would soon become aware of his propensity for it. He kept his blue eyes fixed on hers while a secret laugh appeared to dance behind them. Before he slowly straightened himself again and turned to face the door, a warm smile spread across his face. "I understand. Come." He signaled the deactivation of the seal holding her to the bed by snapping his fingers for dramatic effect, no matter how little it brought. Before the chain reappeared, a faint blue glow pulsed on the ground and walls surrounding her. This time, though, it broke and appeared to unlock at one end before vanishing. With an exuberant laugh, she leapt from the bed and followed Naruto, feeling herself. She could easily overlook a slight skip in her step. He took a quick puff of smoke. He lifted the cigar out of his mouth and looked at the two females and the young phoenix with luminous eyes. There were moments that came with experience, even though the young hatchling had unbounded potential and a great deal of skill and power already. For example, his seasoned skills were demonstrated by the fact that he could be within the hatchling's barrier, exactly where he was leaning against a tree. Nobody reaches his level of age and strength without picking up some practical survival skills. Among them was the ability to remain covert and unnoticed despite his lackluster stealth abilities. As he studied the seals the boy had placed on the ground, he released a quiet whistle. His comparatively limited artistic ability was unable to decipher even the first layer of any seal that was in front of him. He had studied more obscure arts like barrier and sealing techniques for at least 50 years, along with the other two Dark Lords. It was uncommon to find someone so skilled in such arts, but Mikagami had taken barrier techniques like a fish to water. He and the other lord had stopped after the first few decades of headaches. As he reached a single conclusion, a grin appeared on his face. Yukaigakuin life would soon become quite fascinating. After thinking that, he turned and walked, escaping the barrier with little trouble. Strangely, his energy left no trace, his scent never mixed with the air, and the grass beneath his feet never once bent. He simply vanished with the wind as soon as he crossed the 5-meter gap between the outer and inner layers of the barrier. The only sign that he had ever been there was the rapidly dissipating cloud of smoke he left behind. Yukari was compelled to express her admiration. Sealing, was whispered very softly. The sealing arts had once played a major role in the witch community, much as the barrier techniques had been employed and thoroughly researched by some defensive species. But during one of the worst attacks, witches lost most, if not all, of their knowledge of the craft due to attacks from both humans and yokai. The witch community's only remaining seals were storage seals and basic practical jokes that only went so far as to produce eerie noises. While their most skilled users were all killed while attempting to repel assailants, their texts and scrolls had been destroyed. Additionally, the only class of magic that was utilized by all classes was the sealing arts. Their names were derived from the first magic they had learned. Witchcraft, where herbs in the natural world were the primary sources of magic. They branched out from there, and today there are 4 different classes of magic where they transform the most basic form of the natural energy they use into more complex and specialized forms. Wizardry is the practice of using celestial bodies like stars to create magic. Witches learned how to physically alter and manipulate objects with effects that might last forever through sorcery. While mages learned to manipulate elements to suit their purposes, enchanters also used magic to cast illusions, bless objects, and, if they were skilled enough, change the forms of living things. Like all witches, Yukari began in the first class and, because of her talent for magic, she had already begun a second class, something that most others would only do decades later. Her limited knowledge of sorcery enabled her to call forth tangible items, such as her washtubs and tarot cards. Her creations, however, never lasted longer than a day due to her limited proficiency with this type of magic. However, if she were really fortunate, she would be able to enter areas that witches had previously conquered. There was so much natural energy flowing around her that she didn't even need her wand to sense it. The 2 large trees that practically oozed the energy seemed like honey, and the seals around her channeled amounts so large that she had to force herself not to approach them. She could sense what the seals' primary purposes were without having a thorough understanding of them. She sensed the energy's reverberations. The only thing that crossed her mind was, unbelievable. Not only had Naruto discovered a method to safely draw nature energy, despite not being naturally drawn to it, she could feel some of the nature energy being transformed into elemental energy to intensify it, and he had even directed it toward power barrier techniques in the form of seals. She almost drooled when she said, "To think that all this is done by seals." The old stories her people told did not accurately depict the reality. Although she was aware that all social classes used sealing, she was previously unaware of its purpose. But now the reason was obvious. Sealing could be used in a variety of artistic mediums. It was confirmed by the seals directly in front of her. In front of her, sealing techniques were being used for barrier, enchanting, and magical purposes. Mage arts were practiced as part of the energy was transformed into elemental energy to strengthen the house behind her and even improve the soil below. Nature energy was manipulated into a barrier, and enchanting techniques were employed as nature energy cloaked the area by altering its appearance. Seal. Sealing, sealing, the sealing arts. Her mouth was at a loss for words since her higher brain functions were not communicating with it. Naruto watched the changing witch with a slightly perplexed expression. Astonished. He was no longer able to read. All he knew was that the utterly expressionless expression on her face set off some distant warning signs in him. Almost like the ones that emerged from fangirls in the early stages. A chilling sensation crept up his neck as she turned suspiciously to face him. Fortunately for his mental well-being, his unacknowledged fears never came to pass. Yukari gripped her wand more tightly. She wasn't sure why she asked, "You're not naturally attuned to nature energy, right?" Perhaps she wasn't entirely sure, or perhaps it was to confirm her own end. He gave a nod. Naruto was shocked by the sheer amount of need, want, and emotion she expressed when she said, "I'll teach you anything you want, tell you anything you want at all. Anything I can do. But, please teach me the sealing techniques." It wasn't just her request, though. He had vaguely recalled reading about witches in the past, about their varied practices and forms of magic. He paused as a smile appeared on his face and said, "I wasn't and I'm not going to ask just anything. I already had my mind made up from the beginning. Yukari wasn't a child genius for no reason. I want you to teach me how to perform magic. More specifically, nature energy. Especially if any part of it can be used to heal." She lowered her gaze and tapered off, saying, I don't know what is really going on between you and Mizore. But you and her, you really care for her, don't you? Those scars on her." Naruto paused to think, but she went on before he could reply. "To be honest, I found a technique in one of my books that mentions being able to heal such scars. The only problem is that I haven't found a way to gather enough energy to power it. It takes more energy than my wand can handle." That made Naruto pause. He had to immediately fight the impulse to say, "More power than your wand can handle." To be safe, he had sealed her wand in case she did something truly foolish. A substantial amount of his Yuki was contained in the tiny seal he had put on her wand. Enough that her wand would probably burn if it were realized all at once. Reaching out his hand, he said, "Pass me your wand for a moment, would you?" She stepped back, keeping her wand protectively close to her body. "I won't intentionally hurt you, I just want to check something, okay?" he assured you. After giving it some thought, she reluctantly raised her wand. She had to fight the urge to flinch when Naruto took it. Before focusing on the star at the top, Naruto examined it from the bottom, giving the impression that he was watching it closely. He nodded slightly and sent a tiny bit of his Yuki into the seal, saying, "I'm going to try something, okay? If it starts to hurt, tell me." On the wand, it glowed and showed itself. He sent the seal instructions, ignoring the widening of her eyes. He gradually increased the output after initially realizing small amounts of the Yuki stored within. Paying close attention to the catalyst at the top, his eyes could see a much greater variety of waves than most people's, as light as a type of wave with a more detailed node at the bottom. Normal eyes wouldn't have seen much. Furthermore, he had sharp eyes that were able to detect even the slightest alterations. His eyes picked up on the slight color shift, which spread and grew darker with each increase in Yuki output. As it spread out from the star's center, it gradually turned red. However, nothing else appeared to occur. As a result, he increased it repeatedly without realizing that her body was becoming more tense. Her face appeared to be suddenly filled with pain as soon as the color covered roughly 2/3 of the entire star. Her hands closed around her body and she dropped to her knees. She tried to focus her eyes, but her body shook. He bent down and grabbed her by the shoulders, instantly stopping any more Yuki output. Her body didn't immediately stop. "Are you okay? What happened? Why didn't you say something?" she asked. She opened and closed her mouth to speak, but her eyes remained unfocused. He made up his mind after glancing at the weak witch. In an attempt to calm her, he gave her a hug. He released her when her breathing eventually stabilized. With his hands on her shoulders and her gaze fixed on him, he asked, "Are you okay now?" She nodded, her head lowered. Naruto's face twisted in bewilderment as he said, "Sorry. She paused and let her gaze drop from his. I didn't say anything even though it started to hurt. It had been slight at first, so I thought I would be fine. Plus, it's for Mizore. It started as a small boost of energy at first, it actually felt refreshing. But as you went on, it became larger and soon it started to burn. It was hot, too hot, it started from inside as it spread. It was horrible. Another shiver passed through her. After giving it some thought, Naruto made the decision to put the information away for later, but now. If he was correct, Mizore ought to be with Miyuki right now for her daily healing session. Let's get you inside, okay? He might as well make them some light fare as well. They were both always exhausted from those healing sessions. He passed her wand back to her before slowly assisting her inside while gently supporting her from her arms. He had just discovered a means of curing Mizore's wounds, if he was correct, and he managed to make it work. There was a faint smile on his face. Perhaps he had been overly influenced by his previous conflicts with the other members of Mizore's group. All of them were automatically categorized by him as annoying immature brats. He allowed himself to put his faith in the witch after mentally reprimanding himself. To his dismay, the werewolf Ayashi was sitting on a typical student chair with a typical table in front of him and a typical story beneath his pencil. His hand's refusal to write further aggravated him. His fingers shook and his grip tightened. He needed to get it done quickly. It was unable to wait any longer. It was only due in 2 days. As his brain turned cogs that hadn't been so forced in a long time, curses came out of his mouth. He put his pencil down on the paper and poured whatever deeply tense energy he could summon. His pencil broke the instant its very tip made contact with the paper. Jin remained motionless for a few seconds. It was almost as if his mind was trying to process what had just transpired. The world seemed to be working against him. Once more, his hold tightened until his entire body trembled. He dropped the pencil. He clenched and then released his fists. He clenched them once more, and as he slammed his hands down on the table, his entire body shot up. As she pondered and attempted to write, he howled and squeezed the sides of his head. Kurumu chuckled as she offered her advice, saying, "Maybe you should bang your head against the wall, Jin. Senpai. It might help you think." He actually appeared to move into position to do it, which added to her prolonged amusement. He wasn't looking, though. She was powerless to stop him from bringing his head forward. She just watched as his head went past the window frame as she raised the window. His chest came next, then the rest of his body. Even though he had only a few seconds to act, his mind was quick to pass up the chance. He let out a half-formed scream and tumbled out the window, headfirst. "Kurumu!" exclaimed the pink-haired vampire who had been observing in bewildered silence. She hurried to the window out of concern, but the succubus had already locked it and blocked her way. Mocha paused as she recited those words. Don't worry about that pervert Mocha. Besides, he wasn't helping much anyway. One side wholeheartedly concurred with her friend with light blue hair. But her more compassionate side objected. She didn't need to do anything, though. She took a step back and went through another internal argument. Kurumu appeared to notice it as well. What's wrong, Mocha? She asked weakly, gesturing with a finger. It was only toward her, though, and Kurumu felt a sudden coldness sweep over her life. She quickly moved her legs to try to turn around, but as soon as she did, she wished she hadn't. She was more than easily confused by the storm behind the werewolf's eyes. Her breathing simply became shallower due to the obvious annoyance on his face. With all the happiness she could muster, she said, Hi. Hi Jin. Senpai. If it had any beneficial effects, they most definitely didn't manifest. Before she could even yell in protest, a dark glint glistened behind his eyes, and she was suddenly confronted with a different scene. A breeze tickled her hair, and her feet felt less pressed together than usual. Her mouth opened to scream in surprise, but gravity's law overcame her and she let out a scream instead. The pink-haired vampire's anxious cry was easily drowned out by her scream, which reverberated throughout the school. Jin? Sukune inquired as his presence became apparent. He twisted his body around nimbly, turning to face the newcomer. But as he stared in mild bewilderment, he noticed that he was blinking several times. What happened to the girly tone of voice and weak, uncertain, Jin? Senpai, he scratched his head inside. Jin-e. He said it once more, which was very different from how he had sounded just a few weeks prior. It was now laced with confidence and strength, whereas before it had been weak and uncertain. Mocha had looked in, startled and perplexed, and had stopped mid-sentence off to the side. Jin gritted his teeth and then allowed a look of reckless indifference to take over. He wore the same one when he was around dangerous people, yeah? Jin couldn't help but have a humorous tick-mark pulse on his head as he asked, Where is Mizore? He showed his disapproval by waving his fisted hand around. To think that he was on the verge of classifying this Sukune as a threat when his thoughts remained unchanged. You don't come for club meetings for weeks, and then you show up and the first thing you ask is, "Where is Mizore?" he yelled, looking down at his opponent. EHH. He backed up a little when his werewolf senior approached. "Don't you even care about the club at all, Sukune? What about this month's newspaper, what about?" he said, staring weakly as he retreated a few more steps from the werewolf's tirade. As Jin threw himself into the art of ranting, he appeared to be lost in his own world, linking seemingly unconnected items and moving from subject A to subject Z. Fortunately for him, a gentle hand slid into his before he was dragged to the side, where the werewolf could easily miss him. His world kept speeding past him as he opened his mouth to speak, only to find his lips pressed together. A moment later, he was confronted by a particular vampire. He glanced at the playful worry in Mocha's eyes and said, "Shish, Jin. Senpai has been like this for a week, actually, ever since you stopped attending." Mocha's face broke into a soft, playful smile as the atmosphere seemed to lighten and his senses began to experience familiar sensations, just as it had seemed like the world he had known was upending. Then he noticed how much his face resembled Mocha's. Their eyes met each other's, and their faces drew closer. His lips parted slightly as her breath tickled his skin. Her gaze abruptly left his field of vision. His eyes whirled with confusion before he heard a sound he recognized. Kapu-chu. As the vampire's fangs dug deep into his neck, his manly scream reverberated through the school hallways. It appeared that he would need to make his way through his typical exciting schedule before arriving in Mizore. He accepted that he would become a vampire's meal after coming to that old realization. Aside from the toad sage's soft breathing, Danzo's dry voice was the only sound in the hospital room. "It's good to see another one of Konoha's pillars alive and awake." Even though he spent several months in a coma, a ninja wouldn't have lived as long as he did without picking up a few tips, one of which just so happened to help him get sober again fast. He was wide awake and ready to make multiple seals in less than a second. For some reason, the voice that said, "There will be no need for such things, Jiraiya," only made him more cautious. But his mind caught up as soon as his eyes focused on the disabled man. Jiraiya said, "Danzo." He didn't even try to hide the malice in his voice. The subtle twitch that one of the Root Anbu members was trying to conceal was immediately picked up by his seasoned eyes off to his side. Jiraiya would have sworn he saw a smile on Danzo's face if his eyes hadn't been deceiving. However, that dubious interpretation of Danzo's facial expressions became much more ingrained in his memory over the course of the following second. "Unfortunately, you were not the only one who had been badly wounded during battle, Jiraiya. Sarutobi appears to have been killed in action." For a brief moment, his entire body froze, but after years of training, he forced his muscles to relax. However, the old war Hawk's critical eyes had easily picked up and dissected that fleeting moment of vulnerability. The toad sage's eyes were fixed on the wall before him, unfocused. "Who did it?" he asked. The one name he detested above all others was Orochimaru. Murderous rage filled his veins, and his hand clenched around the sheets. Danzo grinned filthily to himself. Although the sage didn't ask, he could sense the question practically leaking off the man. Sadly, Orochimaru wasn't killed. To make it worse, we can't touch him at the moment. The toad didn't even react when he was mentioned as Hokage, so the smile practically became etched in his mind. The leaf is currently in no shape to fight. Losing another one of our strongest right now would only make things even worse. As the 5th Hokage, I will not allow you. However, if you truly want to avenge your fallen sensei, there is a way. As I am sure you remember, we lost our Jinchuriki some time ago. If the leaf can secure another power such as that, we would have enough power for us to allow you to leave the village for certain periods of time. Jiraiya's icy professional side took over, something that had not surfaced in him since the last major conflict. Jiraiya understood exactly what Danzo wanted him to do at the moment. Normally, he wouldn't do anything for the old villain, but this time, a different emotion overcame that old resentment. Danzo left with a secret sense of satisfaction, indicating his decision with a firm nod of his head. Naruto raised a spoonful of hot, delicious soup to his lips and asked, "What's your wand's catalyst made off?" Instead, at first he had looked suspiciously at the yellowish liquid in the bowl, but the smell quickly dissuaded him. Yukari's soup, which the witch also prepared for him, revealed his culinary prowess, or lack thereof. He had no way to make anything even remotely edible, other than heating up pre-cooked food and making instant foods. He had suggested cup ramen as a light snack for Mizore and her healer. Her actions were barely slowed as she busied herself chopping some vegetables into tiny pieces. "It's just a piece of refined crystal from the mines back at home actually. It's the standard catalyst witches use." Naruto had constructed a kitchen that was surprisingly well equipped. What about other catalysts? He asked, his keen eye consuming every detail he could find. There were visible cracks, grooves, and even color variations. Although there are other possible bases we can use, it's rare that we do so. Generally speaking, catalysts are developed from basic witch crystals. The base crystal can be developed, with the right skills, into pretty much any kind of catalyst needed. His mind rapidly tested dozens of possibilities while noting any unknown outcomes for testing on the field, as he combed through the untold centuries of practical experience he had accumulated through the use of shadow clones. She straightened herself and said, with a hint of pride, in fact, the catalyst that my wand uses is a base crystal refined by myself. Her head lowered as he listed each flaw. Some cracks here, a bit dull at the side, several uneven grooves that hamper smooth energy glow. With every word he spoke, however, her eyes grew more indigenous rage, and her hands clenched in frustration. She grabbed her wand back from Naruto in a move that was faster than most people could see. It's already great for a witch my age. You can't expect a perfect piece of work. With a few stiff movements, a large washtub appeared over Naruto. Its menacing silver glint seemed to taunt him as it cast its shadow over him. However, his mind continued its mental experiments while he was largely unaware of the circumstances. He only filtered through the results he had already arrived at, even when he noticed the washtub above him. From what he had felt earlier when channeling energy into her tarot cards and his recent observations, his curious side overtook him. Suddenly, the lethal washtub above him seemed more like a chance to conduct an experiment. He raised one hand and directed varying amounts of chakra into each area of his palm. He accomplished what might have been regarded as an extremely, nearly impossible feat when his palm made contact with the tub. Tendrils of his chakra extended from his palm at different speeds, lengths and width. His energy had a darker purpose than the last time he sent it into her magical creations. Snaking their way into the very structure of the tub, they sought for weakness while destabilizing everything they neared by flooding every gap within. It resembled a wall with several layers, weak points, and holes. He discovered a good dozen in this instance. As her washtub broke into smaller pieces, then smaller pieces, and finally vanished entirely, deconstructed, a smile effortlessly etched itself onto his face. He put on a sheepishly innocent face as her stunned gaze met his. Without his smile, the act would have been flawless. At the same time that her body tensed and relaxed, dozens of questions raced through her head. What? How? Her mind was split between shock, disbelief, and annoyance. Her rational mind refused what her eyes had just seen. With a stern command, a whole truck load of washtubs appeared over him. This time, his face was one of challenging confidence. Lifting both hands above him, he sent up hundreds of chakra tendrils. With him having already memorized the pattern from the first tub, he could dispel subsequent ones much faster. It happened again, right in front of her. As soon as they were made, all of her washtubs broke into tiny pieces and vanished, leaving only his raised hands and the glittering objects around him as proof that he had done anything. She opened her mouth once more, but this time she was unable to come up with a suitable response. It's because your catalyst is poor. He commanded her whole attention with that sentence. In less than a few minutes, her skills, which she had spent years learning and honing, were dismantled, and by someone who wasn't magically inclined. She was filled with indignant rage. Her face flushed and her fists clenched at her sides as she said, "Well, I'm sorry, I can't do anything better than this. It's not like I'm not a child." As he pretended to be a naive innocent, he asked inquisitively, "But Yukari, aren't you a child genius?" She stumbled when she tried to respond, frantically looking for a way to protect herself without compromising her self-respect. The only thing that came out of her mouth was, "Like you could do any better." But for Naruto, that had been a challenge that he had accepted. The challenge was aimed directly at her face. "If you have any extra crystals lying around, we can find out about that." She bristled at the smirk on his face, which was only a few centimeters away from hers. She wasn't entirely sure for some reason, but since he had never encountered refinement before, she shouldn't have been afraid. That was what she tried to convince herself of as she resisted taking a step back from him. She gave him a glare of her own and said, "I'll get some from my room then, just wait." He picked the girl up in his arms and smiled cheekily, saying, "Oh no, we won't have to wait that long." As she found herself beneath his face, her mouth opened, but his legs blurred, before she could say anything. She gripped him tightly and let out a yelp. Her eyes were unfocused as she tried to make sense of the fast-paced surroundings, and the world blurred by them. In less than a minute of dizzying motion, they came to stop. Her head rolled about a bit as her senses sought to rebalance themselves. As her vision refocused, the first thing that registered was his face. "You okay?" he asked with empathy. He himself had to train his mind to keep up with his speed several times. Whenever he went faster than he could handle, painful crashes were unavoidable. He experienced severe headaches and vomiting, which made the minutes he spent trying to make sense of things later even worse. Still, he couldn't keep the amusement out of his eyes. The glint in his eyes caught her attention. Bastard, she shook her head a couple of times before a cough interrupted her. A laugh escaped him as she threw her fists onto his body. He used his left hand to gently but firmly grab both of her wrists and hold them down. Now, that's enough, Yukari. Imouto, younger sister. So, mind telling me which one is your room? She said in a stupid, huh? Her eyes grew wide as she looked in the direction he was pointing. Bringing his hands up, she rubbed her eyes before opening them again. How? The girls' dormitory was right in front of them. They themselves were on a tree. How did you? Her shaky tone was easily overtaken by his. His place was at least an hour away by foot. She merely raised a finger and gestured to her room's window, saying, I can move fast, really fast. So which one is it? However, she failed to learn. The world around her blurred for a few seconds before she let out another clipped scream. When her world came back into focus, she found herself in her room. She glanced at her window out of curiosity. They unlatched the lock. Given the direction she was facing and the way her brow was raised, he could easily deduce what was perplexing her. He displayed some of his yukai by saying, a trick my grandfather taught me. I can somewhat solidify my yuki to a certain extent. So I slipped a tendril in through under the window and lifted the latch. As it enveloped the witch, it slightly solidified and turned liquid, like. She closed her eyes and nodded, taking in the sensation. Feel it? She asked. She felt as though she had been gently wrapped in cozy blankets. It was as if the blankets were being gradually removed as he let go of his yukai. When Naruto sat her down on the bed, she was completely unaware of it. So, where's the crystal? She held a mixing bowl with a strange blue dot and pink mixture in it and said, let's take a look at how your wounds are healing today. She positioned herself on the bed obediently and then lifted her sweatshirt. She just welcomed the chill as it touched her skin because the room had already been cooled. When Miyuki turned to face her on the bed, she couldn't help but notice a detail. The teasing opportunities caused her to giggle inwardly. There was a thigh pouch on her thigh, but she knew it was Naruto's because it wasn't just any thigh pouch. After all, he was the one who had created it. The straps, which at first appeared to be nothing more than a mess to her, began to make sense after he explained to her and Kazushi how each worked. Her arms were still wrapped because they were the most severely injured, even though her legs had mostly healed. She was fine except for the odd sore spot on her torso, but those marks that Kuyu had specifically burned into her skin. Miyuki was tending to Mizore's face while she gazed out the window, asking, they're permanent, aren't they? Her cheeks still bore the scars Kuyu had left on them. On the bed was the scarf she had been wearing over her face. Miyuki gave her an uncomfortable look. It's not impossible to heal, it's just that I'm not even sure what to do to heal them. Mizore wrapped her arms around her legs and pulled them in. As her pained eyes gazed out the window, she whispered to herself, he still likes me now, but what about a year later, or a few years later when he'll realize that I'm going to be like this forever? Miyuki's hands started to console her, but they stopped. Mizore. Her face grew softer. Based on her knowledge of Yuki, Ona, she could understand, at least partially. They always tried their hardest, giving their all to be the best versions of themselves for their partners, even though it was never easy for them to find truly sincere partners. With those scars on her face, it would feel like she was confronting an insurmountable obstacle that she would never be able to overcome. She felt as though she had just been dealt an impossible hand by fate. She put her arms gently around the Yuki, Ona, and said, he won't Mizore. If he promises you something, he won't break it. Her body trembled and she stopped crying. Mizore would normally have noticed, but this time she was only able to feel her pain, let alone embarrassment at Miyuki's assumption, a valid one, at that she and Naruto had made some sort of promise. A tiny glow appeared on her right wrist beneath her bandages. At first, it went unnoticed, barely illuminating her bandages. But it became brighter as she sobbed. Miyuki noticed that she was buried in her hands, her hair casting shadows over her face. She carefully removed the bandages from the girl's right arm under the pretense of healing, taking care not to wake her. With each layer of white that came off, her anxiety increased. She noticed her healed skin as she got closer to the wrists. It had healed far more quickly than she had anticipated. Before long, a symbol on her wrist became visible as the source of the light. She saw the lines and patterns, suppressing a gasp. An encircled phoenix. But before she could ponder, she heard a knock. She briefly sensed and recognized the energy signature of her own grandson with ease. Naruto's brows were furrowed behind the door, asking, "Is everything fine?" Something had suddenly materialized deep in his stomach, and he was unable to describe it. An uneasiness that grew. Miyuki looked back at the girl, who was now quiet. She made a decision with ease after considering all of the information she had so far acquired and adding a little intuition. She saw the Yuki Onna tense next to her and said, "Come in, Naruto." The door clicked open, and another shudder went by her body. Wah! He halted in the middle of his stride when he saw Mizore's huddled figure. His uneasiness increased. He approached her right away and knelt down in front of her. Mizore? He could easily see the marks because she wouldn't look up and her scarf wasn't on. Mizore? He asked once more, but she remained silent. Mizore? She asked, sensing the increasing concern in his voice. Am I? The obvious emotion in his voice was too much for her to handle. She hurled herself at him. Her face found a place buried in him, and her arms twisted around him. Her silent sobs never left his clothing as his arms held her while she sobbed. He was so distressed that it seemed as if her grief was pouring into him as well. He whispered sweet nothings into her ear while making soft circles on her back. She lifted her head slightly off his chest when she had finally stopped crying, but he was still hiding her. She whispered softly against him, "Thank you." However, Miyuki's eyes were fixed on the glow emanating from Mizore's wrist. As Naruto approached, it had gotten brighter, and when they embraced, it was at its brightest. The glow then faded as her tears stopped. That mark was peculiar in and of itself. It functioned as a mate mark, or at least a mark for a possible mate, but from what she knew, phoenix marks didn't form there or at this point. She had a mark at her collarbone, just like Kazushi and, based on her recollections, her parents. The only thing that all of the symbols had in common was that they were all phoenixes. For the time being, it appeared that she could keep it from those two because the mark had vanished, but she would need to conduct some research. She shouldn't tell them too young in case they get the wrong impression. As he asked, his fingers intertwined with the purple strands of her hair, playing gently, "What happened?" She took a deep breath, held it for a moment, and then shakily released it. When his hands became a little tighter, she said, I'm fine now. It was just girl stuff, Naruto. Naruto's face began to flush at that point. He shifted his legs and let go, looking sideways in embarrassment. He set himself down and got to his feet, putting his hand on her shoulder and giving her another glance. He glanced at Miyuki, who grinned, and said, if you need me, shout." He left the room, albeit a little awkwardly. The memory of a clone reached him after the door closed. After giving it some thought, he couldn't help but shake his head at the blatant ignorance displayed by some of his clones. He was unaware of the reason, but after numerous intriguing encounters, he was certain of it. He remembered some of them, and they sent shivers down his spine. He left for his study, ignoring, or rather, suppressing, that memory. He took a seat at his work table and picked up a brush with a fine tip while his clones worked on ever larger projects outside. But his thoughts would not go back to what he had been doing. He took a deep, soothing breath and massaged his head to relieve the growing headache. He had never been distracted from his work mood by anything other than physical contact. Kazushi and Miyuki could both confirm that he could never hear them clearly, no matter how loudly they screamed. Then, just moments before, while he was working on the witch crystal, an unexplainable sensation just appeared and took him away. It was almost as if he had sensed Mizore's suffering. Hey, come in. As he entered the room, his first impression was of the dim lighting and the shifting shadows in every corner. "Shizuka mentioned you wanted to see me, Sukune-kun." As soon as the headmaster's glowing eyes locked on him, a chill ran down his spine. He stumbled over his words at first, but Hokuto's speech training quickly took over. "I want to look at Naruto's and Mizore's files." The headmaster's eyes narrowed. This was what he had anticipated would happen. A seemingly random newcomer suddenly appeared, and it's unclear how this newcomer is related to Sukune's ice friend. It simply never occurred to him in this manner. Sukune had developed a real backbone, but since when? For what reason? He seemed uncertain after hearing that. Sukune was ill, prepared, but the headmaster was able to recognize the signs with ease. Sukune was preoccupied with listing every conceivable explanation that came to mind, and in an instant, he blurted one out. He only realized the folly of his reasoning and its shortcomings after he had said, "Well, as they are both in my class. As the class chairman, I want to know my students better." The headmaster sighed to himself, wondering when he would have some good pupils. He didn't seem to be getting anywhere when he said, "If you want to know your classmates more, you should spend time with them and socialize." He swore under his breath and made himself bow while expressing gratitude. Another creature emerged from the dancing shadows in the room as the door closed. "You do remember that smoking is prohibited within buildings, right?" he asked, turning to the headmaster and putting the large cigar away from his mouth. They looked into each other's bright eyes. The bus driver remarked, "It looks like the outcast Ayashi have already made their move, nay?" He let his eyes drip with frustration as he stared at his friend. "You just love to state the obvious, don't you?" "Like you don't?" he asked, fighting the impulse to slam his face against his desk. Why did he never seem to pick things up? This was another of his plans that just wouldn't go as planned. There was a part of him that cursed the Phoenixes because the only other times he had worked with them, he had had such complex plans that just fell through. He had no idea how long his newest Phoenix student lived or even if they could die, so he couldn't even be certain which generation he had worked with. He only knew that their population was rather small for an immortal race. He had attempted to investigate it once, but only once, because it had seemed suspicious. Just because he had nearly lost his life that one time. That day, the memory of escaping fireballs and fire beams had been burned into his mind forever. The worst part was that he had not even been able to identify the shooter or what was responsible. In fact, he wasn't even certain that it was a single person or object. The flaming projectiles never stopped, no matter where he ran that day. Either from the ground, the sky, or directly beneath his nose. Startled, he immediately stopped thinking about it because he did not want to relive that experience. The bus driver's glowing eyes met his slightly weakened glare, and he received a simple smirk in return. The irony. He muttered to himself, "Nothing but another big headache," as the bus driver turned away, his smile still firmly fixed on his face. His plans, which he had revised, and reconsidered more times than he would like to acknowledge, were on his desk. He shuffled them and stacked them neatly on the left side of his oak table. He felt old, much too old, because of the worn texture under his fingers and the occasional eraser dust. "Up for a drink tonight?" he asked, nodding without even looking up as a tiny smile appeared on his lips. Now he realized why they remained friends. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. The bus driver just smiled and said, "We'll see who can last longer then."
That's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this great story. See you in the next one.